Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the War Report. And we have quite a bit to cover today, from news out of Ukraine, the Middle East, even getting into East Asia. Not so much out of Europe this week. And unfortunately, we were not able to give you a show covering some of the news that we had missed because we did have to end a bit abruptly last time, but we'll be able to fill you in on a bit of that. But I suppose that without further ado, we can get right into it. And if you want to give us a brief snapshot of what's going on in Ukraine on the ground right now.
Okay. So I'm going to begin with probably the most westernly locale from Ukraine, and it's happening right now. Um, since the last show, I think we're just exactly a week since, there have been three, and counting today, four massive strikes, combinations of drone and missile by the Russians on Ukraine. Last week, I mentioned that there was some kind of an administrative building that was hit where it was suspected that it was a command post of some kind. We're talking more higher rank officers, not like lieutenants and stuff, smaller command posts that are closer to the front line, right? Um, since this week, another building that was suspected of housing recruits, possibly mercs, and probably foreign officers was hit. Again, this is speculation. And then tonight, this is according to what the Russians are saying. So it might be true. It's definitely not outside the realm of possibilities. But that said, there's a massive strike that just literally started a half an hour ago, and several Russian strikes in Odessa region and Odessa itself, Zatoka and Sergeyevka, mass strikes on coastal facilities, armed forces of Ukraine. There were campus for recruits and training grounds. Nikolaev region again has been hit with kamikaze UAVs. These are the drones. The strikes are happening everywhere. Also in Zaporozhye, Dnipropetrovsk. It's mostly in the central and central eastern part of the country where this is taking place. And as I say, it's the fourth one in about a week, in the last 7 or 8 days. Um, what else can I tell you? So, moving slightly westward now on the eastward rather on the front line. Since last week's show, there was a successful Ukrainian drone attack that happened. Uh, uh, it caused a massive fire, disseminated to the media, and it probably indicates, just like some of the other topics that we're going to get into when we move out of the minutia minute, which just focuses on the battlefront. Um, it's in preparation for the offensive. So what they want to do is take out um, oil supplies, the transportation of oil. And this was mirrored by two successful attacks on Russian train transport and the Belgorod region, which is just north of Ukraine. It shares a border. It's just north of Kharkov. So that place was hit. There was another train that was derailed, I believe, in Belarus, and that might also have been the work of sabotage. Two other attempts were foiled. I believe at least one suspect has been caught since. To return back to Crimea, today there was a swarm of drones, 20 in all. They were successfully brought down. Yesterday there were 10 drones that were brought down. So there's a lot of pressure on on the Russians right now. The Ukrainians are fixing to destroy Russian logistics, and this time it's primarily fuel. Moving just ever so slightly east, just on the other side of the Kerch Strait, which is the Krasnodar area, not far from Rostov-na-Don. There was another oil site that was hit. This is a much smaller one. I believe it was definitely hit once. and it might have been hit yesterday again. Um, again, these are spectacular attacks. Optically, they get a lot of coverage in Western media, and but I think also one of the biggest factors why they happen, besides the practical purposes of delaying a Russian response to a Ukrainian offensive, is that it raises the morale of Ukrainian troops, right? This big counteroffensive that they're talking about, they're saying it's 9, possibly 10 brigades. And now I'm seeing indications that it's not 4,000, but 5,000 per brigade, which is the maximum. So instead of 48,000, it's probably more like 60, possibly 70,000. So it's a larger force than was initially estimated, and that includes even Western media sources that were throwing out that figure of 48,000, 50,000. I think we're looking at, let's say, a safe bet is 15,000 more than that. There was a terrorist attack on a guy named Prilepin. Prilepin is, I mean, he was a former soldier. He's one of these war correspondents. There was a terrorist attack. This happened in Russia proper. 2 mines were placed in a country on a country road. Obviously, this means that they knew he was going to be showing up. The suspect has been caught, and he has admitted to it. It did not kill Prilepin, but it did kill his driver, who was also former military. Prilepin is actually in good shape. He's doing jokes. One of the statements he said, "There is a God, and we will win." And so it's encouraging that because it is still very sad news. I mean, his buddy is dead, and I mean, the car was almost split in two. I don't know how this guy survived. I really don't. It's incredible. So let's move further east and further north. Positional battles still taking place in Zaporozhye. Most of it is artillery exchange. In Ugledar, there was a Ukrainian counteroffensive that pushed the Russians out of the Dakias that are directly south of Ugledar. The Russians managed to repel them, and a few hours later, they reoccupied that area. The Russians made small gains east of Ugledar, and they've managed to repel another formation. Just to briefly return to Zaporozhye, there was another probing attack. Now, we saw 2 probing attacks that took place a few weeks ago, and this was reconnaissance in force. So it's not a huge column. Like, they can be anywhere from like 3 to 6 vehicles, anywhere from 50 to maybe 100 men. Generally, if it was like a big offensive, it would be the prelude to that would be a massive artillery strike. No such strike like that occurred, but reconnaissance in force doesn't always mean that you're willing to sacrifice 3 to 4 vehicles, which is what happened this time again, and the lives of, I don't know, 20 to 30 soldiers killed in action, just to find out if where the weaknesses are in your opponents. If you can't take an area and then wait for reinforcements, then you will. That isn't what happened this time, however. And let's move further north in the east in Donbass and Avdiivka. They are the typical battles. Marinka, again, extremely slow going. Last week, they captured an industrial area in the southwestern part of the city. It's not even a city. I mean, it's hard to describe it. People have seen videos of Bakhmut. Marinka is far, far, far more devastated. It's I don't know how to describe it. It's just mounds of rubble. Some of the mounds have like the beginnings of a corner where two walls meet, but that's about it. Um,
Let's just put it this way. In wars to come, this will be the footage that they recycle in order to try to build up support for an intervention.
right. And inside every house was a little grandmother,
Of
and
course.
she clutched onto a blue and yellow flag. And
And
so
the
anyway,
pickle jar. And the pickle jar.
yeah, they couldn't fire off the pickle. So, um, fighting there is probably on a smaller scale, but probably just as bloody from what I've seen. A few weeks ago, I told you the story where both Ukrainian and Russians entered the same house, a few standing houses for roof, and they annihilated each other. Like none of them came out. Roughly four men each. There was a point where like a grenade went off. It was so that's how insane this war is. Um, Going further north, attacks on Donetsk. Another man was killed today. There have been several fatalities since, not as much as the last show. That could be because the Russians have made some more gains around Avdiivka, which is what's supposed to be the area that the Ukrainians are using to shell the city. And then we get to Bakhmut. Um, so Bakhmut, less than 3% of the city of Bakhmut is now under Ukrainian control. We'll get into Prigozhin. I won't get when we get into Prigozhin. We'll explain, the losses that he's experienced there. We'll try to figure out why he made the videos that he did. But I can say that um, there has been progress. It's slow progress, but it's progress nonetheless. Um, so this now is a very small area. The area almost west of the citadel is almost entirely taken by the Russians. There's a gymnasium, I believe, there that has been taken, and possibly a hospital. They've made encroachments, the Russians have, into the citadel area as well. Um, so very, very fierce fighting with high casualties on both sides. One small thing I'll say about Prigozhin before we get into it is that um, less than 12 hours after his complaints about a lack of munitions, and I'm being generous, it was even shorter than that. Um, they began raining incendiary bombs all over the Citadel section. I don't know if I sent you a video of this area that is just devastated now. And today, using the Air Force. So, uh, what can I say? Uh, he's, what when he says he's low, what does he mean by low? Um, Obviously, it's the biggest battle on the front, and the dividing of ammunition has to be such that most of it has to go to him. Um, that's where the most amount of killing and territory being taken is happening, and that's where the most amount of expenditure of lives is taking place. So, anyways, so that's Bakhmut. In Solidar, the Russians lost a small bit of territory in the north, in a farming area just south of Seversk. However, they managed to take some land around again that city Belogorovka that keeps going back and forth. It's also like it's almost as devastated as Marinka. So anyway, the Russians made some gains there a few days ago, and the Russians are keeping the line basically in the Kremenaya, Svatove, Kupiansk direction, and that's about it for for the minutia minute. There's small gains, but most of the stuff that's happening right now is still in Bakhmut, and to a lesser extent, of Avdiivka.
Well, thank you very much. And there's just one last thing I would like to add onto the Minutia Minute that is somewhat battlefield related, but not down to the nitty gritty of it. And that is the demographics of some of these men going into battle now.
Ah, yes.
So, we have seen previously where it has been Western Ukrainians who have avoided going into combat. But there have been some casualty lists out of,
Hmm.
I believe it was Bakhmut, that was just a list of men who were from Lvov and Western Ukraine. And that
Yes.
has been a large part of the problem with the manpower is that they have been refusing to put a lot of these Western Ukrainian units and a lot of these Western Ukrainian forces onto the front lines for obvious reasons. They're clearly sending in the central and more specifically the Russian speaking Eastern Ukrainians to take all the flak and then moving in the Western Ukrainians when the situation is much safer now. Maybe not so much in this case, but it has gotten to the point in the war where they are no longer willing to make those exceptions, that they're no longer that they're willing to compromise their more, let's just say, ethnically driven views in order to actually hold these lines, in order to plug these gaps and prepare for a possible counteroffensive. So I did think that was interesting that we're finally starting to see a lot of Western Ukrainians and not just Eastern Ukrainians and non-Ukrainian minorities actually being put into the thick of these battles now that the situation demands it. Which, if you consider it now, I don't think the manpower would have been enough even if they had sent all of them in the first place. All they've done is waste their forces, and now are sending them in to also get wasted in this. Now, we'll talk a little bit more about the counteroffensive, what that's going to look like, some of the things that have happened. But point being is, unless there is a major shift in this war, it's just a matter of time before these men suffer the same fate. So realistically, what they got is a few more months out of it, which I still don't quite understand the strategy because is the idea that they were supposed to leave Ukraine, and how does that help Ukraine become even further depopulated? At least from, I mean, we all know this war is not being fought on behalf of the Ukrainian people, no matter what anyone might say. Even the most rabid of Ukrainian nationalists from Galicia or Lvov or wherever, even they have to know at a fundamental level what the score really is. In fact, a lot of them admit to it. They say, "Oh, we're just playing the long game. As soon as we dislodge the Russians, we can finally build our perfect Ukrainian state, whatever, whatever." But now we're seeing that they've sent these men into the meat grinder to either be killed, captured, whatever, and they have to bear the brunt of it now that those lines have been thinned out. And what that will do to Ukrainian manpower shortages, I'm not entirely sure because
Mm.
Ukrainian manpower still is thinner, but these troops are better trained because they've been able to stay out of the heat of combat for months now. They've been able to stay in the west of the country. They've been sent to Western countries like the UK, Germany, US, whatever, to go train with their military forces and come back. So perhaps that's what the real hope is now that they're trained by a more proper military force. They can plug the gap and what turn the war around to the point where they're going to retake Crimea. Now, that's the Ukrainian claim for the counteroffensive, that they aim to retake Crimea. Now, I don't think anyone,
Mm.
even in Kiev, believes that, but that is the narrative that they have to tell. That is the story they have to tell for the morale and the propaganda, that we're going to dislodge the Russians and retake Crimea. Although, again,
Right.
everyone knows that's not going to happen, but nothing less can be said by Kiev at this point.
Right. And we'll return to the topic of the counteroffensive because, like Prigozhin, the counteroffensive is like one of the big subjects right now in Ukraine. But I just wanted to add two or three things. One of the things I wanted to say with reference to what you just said about more and more like proper Western Ukrainians are dying in Bakhmut. Now, I verified this 2 weeks ago. Like, I can tell the difference between Ukrainian and Russian, and Russian with like a southern twang that uses some Ukrainian words as well. And so I asked my buddy Sasha, And I said, "What have you noticed about uh, more of the videos, the combat videos, especially the ones coming out of Bakhmut?" He goes, "I'm hearing a lot of you," and Sasha's from there, so um, he says, "I'm hearing a lot more Ukrainian now, as much or more than that I'm hearing Russian." So that was an interesting thing to note. These guys that are dying might. I'm not saying there's no possibility that they could have been the ones that were trained. They also could be guys that have already fought in certain theaters, survived, and went on rotation to safer places, and now they've discovered that they're running out of central and eastern Ukrainian guys who speak mostly Russian, and now they're needed to fight in Bakhmut. And you also see like two Canadian mercenaries, two American mercenaries died. One of them was a Marine. The other guy was a young guy, also military experience, served in Iraq. Um,
And as we'd mentioned
he
in
was
previous
he was
weeks,
shortly in Azov for a while. And an interesting thing I found out is, during the elections, like Azov was one of the groups that were counting votes.
I wonder how
Very,
that could have
very,
skewed the
very
results, but
fortified election. So, anyways, the other thing I wanted to mention is since the last show, there was an exchange of prisoners, and for the first time, the Russians had, I think, two or three more men that they got back than the Ukrainians did. However, today there was, just a few hours ago, there was a report of another prisoner exchange. Rather, it happened yesterday, but more details emerged today, and that is three Russian pilots that have been in captivity since last March, not this March, March 2022, have been returned for roughly 45 guys that fought in Azovstal, in Mariupol. And just a bit of clarification, there was a nationalist who went on Ukrainian TV, and he's furious that the Turks have not released um, the Azov guys who were moved to Turkey. Now, there's a bit of Turkey news we'll get into later, but his complaint was that they're being poorly treated and that they cannot go back to Ukraine until, well, one report says that they're not going back. Like when this war is over, they're going to Russia. These are the guys that the Russians believe committed atrocities in Mariupol, either in 2014 and 15 and the years following, or in from February 2022 and onwards,
and I'm
right?
glad you pointed that out because a lot of people do tend to forget that a lot of the guys early on in the war who were fighting in places like Mariupol have been the same, let's just call them what they are, terror brigades who have been there since the outbreak of the Donbass War. The ones who have terrorized the population into silence. The same people we saw in Kharkov after the Russians got driven out, who collected the names and addresses of the people, even accepted food aid from the Russians, just and that was their definition of collaboration, even just accepting basic life necessities. So these are the people who, look, I clearly have my biases here, but absolutely deserve to be shipped back to Russia and put on trial for the things that they
Yeah.
have done over the past decade. And in that same vein, it has been a year. It has been, what, 9 years actually, since the fire in Odessa. That
Yep.
was 2014, I believe, or was that 2015?
2014,
So, yes, it has been 9 years since,
May 2nd.
yes, May 2nd, 2014, height of the immediate post Maidan, because Yanukovych was driven out in February of 2014. He fled to Russia. And then what happened after that was, of course, the setting up of the new government, the quote unquote elections that brought somebody like Poroshenko into power, and the ultimate crackdown of any, at least just not anti Russia elements within the country. And I'll actually get into some of these names here because they're not what you'd expect. Now, Odessa has always been a very mixed city in terms of Russian and Ukrainian identity. Since the outbreak of the war, it has become far more Ukrainian and far more influenced by the Ukrainian. And I just want to read off just a few of these names to get an idea of what we're talking about here, because again, these weren't just ethnic Russians who died in this and who were also the victims of this. So we have a lot of the names that you'd expect, but for example, we have a Netnenko, and let's see, there were a few other very Ukrainian names that stuck out in all of this,
Yeah.
and there were about 47 people who died in all of this.
Oh,
Now,
48.
yes, 48, and admittedly, it is a bit hard to tell because the names are very similar, especially to the untrained ear. But there is an interesting Telegram post on it that I would certainly recommend you check out, that I will be certain to link below this, because it really paints an interesting picture as opposed to what you've been told about this conflict from the powers that be, of course, since the beginning of it. Since Ukrainian is really just an identity on a gradient. Sometimes you have the same people in the same area who identify more with the state out of Kiev, the Ukrainian identity. Sometimes they are more oriented towards Russia. And these are the people who go back and forth, where their identity actually is pretty, and I hate to even use the term because of the certain connotations taken on in other contexts. Their identity is very fluid in terms of ethnicity and language. And maybe not so much language, but they are the ones who do speak that Russian with intermixed Ukrainian vocabulary and with that more southern accent, as you were talking about earlier. So
Hmm.
it was these kind of things that really people like to talk about. This war galvanized Ukrainian identity. This war turned Ukraine into a proper ethnos. When really, the formation of a proper ethnos, so to speak, out of Ukraine has been a result of the terror of the past decade at least, and it does go on further than this, but the post-Maidan era of the suppression of any sort of traces to Russia, any ties to Russia, whether it be claiming historically Russian things about Ukraine to actually have been Ukrainian, or outright expunging them altogether. And I think what we're seeing here is that Ukraine has set itself on, for lack of a better term, a purity spiral. That who will ever be Ukrainian enough to be a Ukrainian at this point? When
Hmm.
is it simply just Galicia? In that case, why do you want this far vast reaches of eastern Ukraine? Do you just plan on sending everyone into the meat grinder and then repopulating it with your nationalist Galician Ukrainian population, and that's going to be the true Ukrainian land? It's once again, it's fundamentally an incoherent
Kind
ideology.
of does seem that way, right?
I mean,
Like they
yeah, that's the
the
plan, and
the Russian speakers are dispensable, right?
exactly, exactly. But they also can't have that land, and they also can't be associated with Russia. And once again, it's a very self-consuming ideology. And you might think that how can nationalism of any sort be a self-consuming ideology? Well, when things like this happen, when your ethnogenesis isn't quite what, say, a lot of Western ethnicities had, or even a lot of other. I mean, for example, the Poles have a far stronger ethnogenesis, despite the fact that they have not been on the winning end of their own history for the past 3 centuries or so, if we're just looking at things objectively. But they still, I don't think anyone would say that the Poles are just wayward Russians, whereas there's a very real case you could say many Ukrainians are just wayward Russians.
Yeah, yeah, and I think there's also another angle, and that is like a lot of Russians who are upset that Russia didn't take the path of being part of the EU. Not that again, not that the West was ever going to let it do that, or the path of joining NATO. The West declined twice. So I don't know what they're on, but I would say that there's this feeling like I don't know, but that Russia didn't do it. It's Russia's fault it didn't do it. Therefore, um, it has to it has to pay. I've got some of the names, by the way. So guys with names like Balaban, Viktorovich, uh, Gennadievich, they're not like Yurievich. There are Russians with that classic itch ending. That's true, but in my experience, it tends to happen more with Ukrainians than it does with Russians. Uh, so, anyways, there's some of them like have, in my opinion, they have like some of them have Ukrainian sounding names, some of them don't. But again, we these populations have intermarried for a long time. That's why you have like videos of like cousins phoning each other, taunting each other, saying, "Yeah, your boys are getting killed," that kind of thing. We saw that from the very beginning of the war.
I mean, what
Um,
is it? A quarter of people in Moscow have a surname of Ukrainian origin.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So, and it's the kind of name that, in my experience, tends to happen more in the central and eastern part, but not exclusively. Because Ukrainians moved out of like their area into more eastern parts, like the census for Odessa in 1892 showed like less than 2% of the population identified as Ukrainian. So it was very, very small, and it gradually grew more since then. And ethnogenesis is it's in some ways like a mysterious process. And we should mention that the guys from Russians with Attitude, particularly Kirill, did like an amazing job of explaining how the Odessa fire itself was the culminating moment that finally gave the myth, the the ethnos establishing myth of the modern Ukrainian state. And what he meant by that was, in their revelry and glee of killing these people, you know, uh, some of these people jumped and died. Some of them survived and were beaten. There's videos. I mean, you can find the videos. I saw the videos 9 years ago, where they're beaten with like not a crowbar, but it's a metal bar of some kind. Some of them were shot with pistols. You see the video of the young Ukrainian girls making Molotov cocktails. Initially, there was, they didn't say anything about it. They kept hush. And then when the Western media started reporting, they said, "Oh no, it was those Russian grandmothers that did this." The thing is that there were two protests at the time. One was like young guys, I don't want to call them soccer hooligans, but you have that sort of classic young Slavic guy meme with the Adidas pants. And they were basically, both sides looked something like that. They were fighting each other. A ways down the road by the trade union is where older people were gathered, middle-aged people, older people, senior people. And I've only seen a few pictures of like young people. That is, let's see, if we're talking about 2014, I saw very few people that looked like they were born in the 90s or even late 80s. Most of them looked like they were born in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. And so it was a totally different crowd. And the fact that the Ukrainians, it's kind of like when you see the tradition of Ukrainians taping people up to a flagpole and beating them, right? There's a particular joy that they get out of like being able to exact cruelty without recompensance or consequences at all. And I think they still live on that because they know there's nothing that they could do that the West is going to condemn them for. Now, in 2014, that was partly not true. There would be some condemnation. And during the Trump years, there was just less of that, or we saw less of that, and the media just wasn't as focused on it as before. But in 2022, 2023, of course, there's nothing like they can do anything. Nothing will happen. The Minister of Defense, the new guy, the young guy, Budanov, I mean, he said, we're going to kill Russians everywhere. And as long as they're here, we're going to kill them. Um, and he's not, there's, he can make those kind of statements. No one will criticize him. Uh, the Western media was successful again in just dehumanizing and um, vilifying Russians, any Russian, and so they feel even more emboldened than they ever have before. But that's their genesis. That it was that moment where they were not willing to apologize. It was around that time that local restaurants in Odessa began to serve dishes that were called burnt Russian or burning Russian. And then in 2022, you had uh, uh, dead Russian baby, burnt Russian baby. So it was like um, we're going to do anything and everything we want. It doesn't matter. We don't have to feel bad about what we did before in Odessa. No apologies, and so
And
on and so on.
it really was one of those defining moments where there was no middle ground to be had. Either you were for that or you were against that,
Yep,
which further solidified the divide in Ukraine,
yep,
whether they want to be a proper Ukrainian state, go down this nationalist project, or whether they want to fundamentally realize that, well, we are Russians. Now, there are some people who have tried to play that middle ground, but we're talking this is back in 2014. But as time has gone on, the situation has become more and more polarized, and especially now
yeah,
that there is active combat in the country, all across the country now, because it was in the Donbass before, but all across the country now, and even some of the parts that aren't directly on the line of contact, once again, there's still a risk of being struck, or there's still a war zone, technically, where you are either pro Russia or pro Ukraine, and
hmm
there's no two ways about it.
yeah. And I think I've heard countervailing arguments about how if Strelkov hadn't started this war, all those people in East Ukraine would eventually have identified it as Ukrainians and not as Russians. It's like one of the most preposterous things you could say. Like it's like saying nobody was upset that the people that they voted, the person that they voted for and wanted, was ousted by U.S. Funded juntas. And guess what? A few years, 5 years later, Zelensky, who did his entire campaign in Russian as a as a as a peace candidate.
Oh yeah,
That's
you can go
that's why
back
he
to our
won.
you can go
That
back
that's
to
why he
you can
that's why he won. It had nothing to do with Strelkov. Like if anything, it's the war, not the peace, that made more people living in Ukraine identify as Ukrainian rather than a Russian. It's the exact opposite of what he said. And it was stuff like Odessa that brought on the war. Like what they're basically saying is um, we got rid of Yanukovych. That's normal and great, even if you voted for him and you feel like a target. And it's totally okay for a superpower to come in and help us do that. And now we're going to dictate everything, and you shouldn't complain just because your president was we tried to kill him, but he got away. You should be happy about that, right? Especially like Western libs who screech about January the 6th, which was a joke in comparison to like what happened in Kiev. You notice that like total disconnect that they have over these events, right?
of course they
They're
do.
pathetic.
And I'm glad you brought up Zelensky's 2019 campaign, because you can go back and watch our episode on it, because I feel like not to talk ourselves up too much. We did a pretty good job covering that.
Yep.
Zelensky campaigned on a internationally observed referendum for
By
the
the UN.
Donbass. For the Donbass,
Yeah.
and I think even for Crimea at that point, where he said, we're going to solve this at the ballot box, we're not going to shoot each other over this, did his entire campaign in Russian, and really talked about finding a diplomatic solution to this, what then was quasi civil war, but now I would say is just outright war between states. And also, you had mentioned the Strelkov thing, which that point I love that point because the argument is Strelkov should have done nothing. The Eastern Ukrainians should have
Yeah.
just sat there and
You
taken it.
should just let us kill you.
They should have just either assimilated or have been exterminated. And they shouldn't have stood up for themselves. They shouldn't have done anything. They should have just complied with our demands. Is really what it comes down to. And Strelkov
Yeah.
is bad for saying, "Well, let's have an organized resistance against this attack on our very personhood." And
Yeah, and let's not forget, in January or very early February, Ukrainian nationalists um, attacked busloads of Crimeans who went to protest, a counter protest in Kiev, right? And the buses were pulled over. These guys just randomly shot with their semi-automatics, and they killed 4 people and wounded over a dozen. So, like, what are you talking about? Like,
and
these people don't feel safe with you. They know your reputation from World War II. They know who has coddled you and who has funded you for decades. They
oh,
know all of
exactly.
that.
They it you said it better than I could have, but also on the point of Crimea, a peninsula full of Russian speakers, where two-thirds of the population call themselves Russian, with one of the largest Russian military presences in the world. I mean, can you imagine
With
what?
their own parliament, it was
Yes,
a semi-autonomous state.
I mean, just imagine what Crimea would have looked like if it wasn't for the massive Russian military presence. Because, of course, as soon as Yanukovych's government falls and all hell breaks loose in Kiev, you already have a massive Russian presence and a semi autonomous government within Crimea, which is why the transition was so bloodless in Crimea. And
Mhm.
the reason why the Donbass has been the exact opposite story is because you didn't have the Russians' presence there, which, once again, I know that this kind of argument doesn't really hold much water, but I still think it's worth making in this context. You're proving exactly why so many of the people in eastern Ukraine wanted to be closer to Russia and wanted to have a Russian presence in their country, and now want to outright be part of Russia.
Right. And also, there were a considerable amount of people in the Donbass who were willing to remain in Ukraine as an autonomous region if Ukrainians could offer security guarantees not to exterminate them. Right. Like, but and it's ironic, like, really, that they were still willing to negotiate like that, because any one of them who would have been tuning into Ukrainian television would have seen total whack jobs who were saying there's 1.5 million of these orcs in the Donbass, and we just have to get rid of them. We have to kill them. We just have to get rid of them.
It's the petulance of the Ukrainian nationalists, because that's all I can think of, that they have to go to such lengths to define themselves against the Russians has done immeasurable damage to their own cause, because I think most of the world, even countries that are ostensibly on Russia's side now, could have lived with an independent Ukrainian state if it remained the federalized entity it was since 91, where you had the very, very Ukrainian population in the west, you had a mixed population in the center, and the more Russian population in the east. And it could have been a bridge between east and west, between the west and Russia. I
Yeah.
think most of the world, including Russia, could have lived with that. But given the support of the American State Department and the other apparatuses that come along with that, they've pushed the envelope so far that they've fundamentally doomed their own cause, and that the best that the Ukrainian nationalists can hope for is either a rump state or to be a strong diaspora lobbying group similar to Armenians or Jews.
Yeah. There's also something interesting Now, I remember this, and about a week or two ago, I saw a video about it, and that is there was a RAND report that came out, I believe, in the first half of 2013, might have been in the second half of 2016, 12. And it um, was picked up by a Finnish journalist. Last name starts with P. I cannot remember his name. And in the report, the RAND report, like it suggested, like, gulags, but gulags light, like re-education camps for Russians that like resisted. And the more he exposed this, right? Just like we saw the 2019 RAND report extending Russia, they took it down and said, no, it was never there. Like that's a fake. It's not real. So many of these, and again, this completely contradicts all that nonsense you hear about a kind of democratic explanation for the way power works in Ukraine, and that is, oh no, I mean, there's a few bad apples, but what? But they don't have any power. When you know that in any civilization at any time, um, it is always a small, well-organized minority that runs a civilization, and it's no
That's why they're
different.
called an
And you
elite, because they're the top of the top.
Right. It's no different in Ukraine, and it wouldn't be different just because it's Ukraine. And the nationalists there were always the most well-funded by the West, and they were the most appeased um, during the Soviet era. I mean, of course, if they got out of line, if they were caught doing terrorist activities, yeah, they would die, or they would die in a gulag, or they would just spend the rest of their lives in prison. I get it, but um, it's that crowd that steered the ship, you know. So anyways, I just want to say that for like all the the worthless arguments about there's only a few bad apples. Um, I mean, you could say that about I mean, were the shit libs in America convinced that most of the people who, I mean, they were mistaken. A few bad apples did not run the Trump campaign or the Trump administration. Everybody, I mean, any normal person would have known he was never going to achieve anything. I was like, before I did the show with you, before I started doing the show with you, I was like, one of the first persons who, like, in my circle of friends, and in a IRL situation, that were worried. I said, "You honestly think he's going to achieve anything?"
Well, I'll tell you something. Donald Trump did achieve something. He made us laugh and smile, which is all worth
He
it at the end
did.
of the
He
day.
did. He did. He really did.
And honestly, like once again, that's my sole basis of supporting for him in 2024 is that he's just funny. And
Mm.
I'll just go on record as saying I've said it before, and I'll say it again, and you'll hear me say that again. But I do get your point, and you are making
Right.
a
Now
very good point
they're
before I
afraid
derail.
that that crowd is eventually going to take over. First, the Trump base, then the Trump administration, and then the country. So they know that it's elites that run the show, even when they pretend that they're not in power, right? They know how this works. It's no different in Ukraine, right? America does not back moderates. They back very violent people that later maybe they can dispose of. Sometimes they can't. But they back them because they're the ones most willing to kill and die for a cause that also aligns with American interests. Like, it's very simple. I don't know why people pretend that this is a complicated situation. It's not.
I mean, most of the people who pretend are being, of course, I'm sure you know this, I'm sure the audience knows this, but just to say on record, are being deliberately obtuse about this sort of thing.
Mhm.
They know exactly what the score is. It's just beneficial to pretend like they don't.
Yes, they're playing the hatchling.
But with that being said, you want to get into some of Prigozhin's statements over this past
Yeah,
week because that was
that
something, and
was
I'll let you take it away.
okay. So I was visiting Geo yesterday, and I was telling him. Uh, you know, there are initially I went through like three different scenarios that would explain why he did it, right? So one scenario was take him at his word. He's being completely honest. He's extremely emotional right now. Um, some people have speculated that he had a nervous breakdown or something. Um, I don't buy the argument that he's a civilian, he's not used to this. I mean, as far as I know, Prigozhin was in charge during Syria, and of course, he made crazy statements that it was Wagner that liberated Syria, not the Russian forces. Um, he knows he knows his guys. He knows how they operate. He has seen them die before. Now, of course, the scale is very different. Okay, and it's much. It's not. Let's just say the scale is different. There's just much more of it. The war in Syria is still going on. He did say that he pulled some of his Wagner forces from Syria to fight in Ukraine. So he's being totally honest, and he may or may not be drunk, but he's being totally honest. This is what it is. The Russian forces are not giving him enough ammo. Maybe they're not producing enough ammo. Huge losses. He claims 1,000 dead in April, which is large. 250 a week. But then when you break it down, because you remember, what's the name of that German journalist on Twitter that even sometimes the NAFO guys hate? Ripoke or
Are you
Recipe?
thinking of Jihadi Julian?
Yeah, Jihadi Julian. Yes. So he was countering them, I believe in February or March, saying, no, it's not like thousands are dying every day or 500 a day. They don't even have that many forces to begin with. And then he quoted Prigozhin, and Prigozhin said, "On a good day, I lose between killed in action. I lose 20 to 25." Now you can extrapolate wounded. That would probably mean anywhere from let's say 75 to 100 wounded on top of the 20 to 25 killed. Right. So 100 guys out of action that day. Right. And he says on a bad day, I lose 50 to 60. And if you extrapolate that, that's anywhere from 200, 225 to 275, maybe 300, right? Um, so if you break down his figure, you know, when he said the video and he's got like, I guess for people who haven't seen it, um, the video is him at night and he's got the dead bodies of Wagnerites who have been killed in battle. And um, he called Shoigu a bitch. He said your daughter is married to this liberal. He may have said that on a different. She is. Um, they're vacationing over here, like they're having a good time. You're not serious, and also Gerasimov is not serious. The thing is he has made these claims since February, right? And he does this, then he finally gets the ammo. He does this, and he finally gets the ammo. And usually the ammo arrives very, very, very quickly. I starting to doubt that they can get the ammo there that quickly. Or he's not that short of ammo because, of course, since February, they're still making gains. Now, you could argue, yeah, but if I had more ammunition, I'd have less losses. So that's the counter argument to that. And so this is, scenario number one. He's being totally honest. He's having like an emotional breakdown at the time. It may or may not indicate like a larger problem, a bigger problem that's could be described as a nervous breakdown. Scenario number two is this is all fake. Yeah, those guys behind him are all dead. Um, but what he's trying to do is present himself as being very weak. And notice he omits um, Surovokin. Surovokin is the guy who's in charge of this. Uh, Prigozhin himself has said it was Surovokin's idea to turn Bakhmut into a meat grinder. for the Ukrainian forces. He wanted them to lose more forces in Bakhmut, which would allow the Russians to stabilize, particularly Zaporozhye, and give them time there to make fortifications, which they've done. Right. So the second argument is repeat all the tropes you've heard about the Russian military since the war began, and some that even predate the war. Right. Disorganized, infighting. Again, it's a question of scale. Every army experiences this. And the tougher the opponent, the more that this tends to happen, or the more that those rivalries have impact. But again, it's a question of scale. How bad is it really? So option number 2 that explains the situation is that he's faking it. And the best evidence for that is like less than 12 hours, or about 12 hours after he makes it, they start bombing the F's out of the citadel, the last part, the 2.5–3% of the city, but particularly the citadel that has all those high rises. It's like a wall on 3 sides of high rises. And it's all incendiary bombs. The next day, they're bombing them. They're not just striking them now with artillery, they're bombing them with planes. And then a video surfaces from Ukrainian television with Podolyak, who's angry that the Ukrainians sent in another batch to go defend Bakhmut, which got partly attritioned along the way and then was unsuccessful in a counterattack when they reached the city. So you could make the argument that if he was faking it, if he was just acting, it worked, right? They appear weak. Syrskyi, the commander in charge of Bakhmut, and most of the forces that are active on the front lines, made this decision. The other explanation that I kind of have is, he has this pattern of behavior that he's been doing for several months, and he's learned it, and he's learned that it gives him what he wants. So it's not that he's being a really good actor. He's in an emotional state. Maybe the losses for him are higher than normal, than what he would like. Although, again, if you break it down, 250 dead per week divided by 7 is very much within the confines of his good day versus bad day. Right? It's a little more, but it's not twice as much. Nothing remotely like that, right? So it could be that, look, he's learned this kind of bargaining, and a lot of people are going to say he went too far. He's embarrassed the families who would recognize their sons, their husbands, their dads lying on the ground like that, right? It was in very bad taste, right? So I tend to think it's actually like scenario 1 does not completely exclude scenario 2. It happened the way it happened. I also think, I said this last month, maybe it was like 2 or 3 episodes ago, that I think Prigozhin wants a political career. And again, that he's like, yes, he wants that. Yes, he wants to wrap up Bakhmut. Yes, he knows that he will get the glory for that, right? He wants to be a hero, right? He's shamed all these traitors. Think of the essay that was published in the newspaper in St. Petersburg, Now he's kind of contradicted himself because, in a way, he's embarrassed Russia to a degree. Although I must say, the Western press has not completely jumped on this in as big a way as I suspected. A lot of people were just shocked, but for
I
many
think there's too
people,
many intricacies for the Western press to make a story out of this. It's not simplistic enough for the NAFO people to cling on to, or
mm,
your average CNN watching liberal. It's beyond their comprehension, frankly.
yeah. So I don't buy the line that he's been too long there, and like that plays a role. I don't doubt it. Or that I also don't buy the idea that it was a dastardly plan. And yes, it was evil and ugly the way he did it. He shouldn't have done it that way, but it worked. Um, at the end of the day, all he did is, he destroyed a few extra columns of Ukrainians that went to fight and hold on to the city were destroyed, right? Enough that Podolyak would be upset, but um, they're still there. The other thing that has surfaced is they were due for a rotation on May the 10th, and he said he would stay there only till May the 10th. Right? I mean, that's pretty convenient, right? That's pretty convenient. Now, I won't get into all the politics. Kadyrov, he's always gotten along with Kadyrov, but Kadyrov believed that the way he did it, his execution was wrong. Um, so you know what? I think it might always be a bit of a mystery. Um, it would be to be honest, it would be scary if what he did that night was purely acting. But I think he's just learned to be that way. I don't think like this is not a guy that's totally out of character. It's out of character for the Putin administration. That's definitely true. However, have you ever seen him get reprimanded? No. You've never seen Prigozhin get reprimanded. You see him get what he wants. And in many cases, what he wants was only a few hours late, or maximum a day late, which would mean it was not he probably knew it was coming anyways. I can't prove that, but to successively complain time and time again, and the stuff shows up between 12 and 24 hours each time, to me, says that maybe there's more foreknowledge that he knows he's going to get the arms anyways, and like I don't know. So maybe that's my third option, the option that I think there's a bit of truth in both options one and two, that they don't necessarily exclude each other. Um, because they really acted very quickly. They got the stuff that he wanted really fast. But the more perplexing thing is, why did he? I felt bad, to be honest. Like I felt bad for him, and I also felt bad for the dead soldiers on the grass. I was just almost a repugnant thing to watch, but at the same time, again, it's a scary idea that he's this good of an actor. I guess part of me doesn't want to believe it, because that would be kind of uglier. But I do think, he has whipped himself up to some degree, right?
Yes,
That
yes.
that he is very emotionally attached to these guys. I mean, he's going out there. That time he climbed on top of that building when they got halfway inside Bakhmut, and he says 500, meters from me over there is where and then the next night they drop some kind of a bomb on it, and it's like totally leveled. Then he climbs in the middle of the night. I'm on top of the building, but the building is less than a floor high. It's just so ridiculous. But like no one, he is heavily invested in this. And I'm just saying, I don't think it's entirely his political career. Like he could have been more hands off and still get the glory. But He wants it in a very legit way, and that to me seems to indicate that he's very sincere about this. So that's my complicated third scenario.
I I would tend to agree with that, and I would say it was an event only befitting of this war because I think in many ways it was a microcosm of everything that has been said, both true and false, about this war, and there's really no other
Yeah,
way that can really be put to that. And Prigozhin, very interesting character. Some people have speculated that he has political aspirations. I'm not sure how much I believe that. And then, of course, there's the talk of, well, of course he's going to fall out of his apartment window because he's too much a threat to Putin, blah, 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 blah.
I don't believe it.
I don't believe that either. Even if he does have political aspirations, I don't believe that either. And then there's the talk of, oh, he's just a front man. He has no military experience. He just hypes up these people. Once again, I don't believe that either. But I do think this was a genuine frustration that was played up for the cameras. And I would say that perhaps this was something that was able to unclog just a touch of military bureaucratic inefficiency because I mean the Russians aren't the only ones who have this issue. This is just any modern military that is going to have
Hmm.
an issue like this when you have so many supplies to deal with, when you have so many logistics to deal with, that things are going to get bogged down. Now, there's been speculations that Wagner has been snubbed so they don't outshine the professional Russian army. Once again, I
Hmm.
don't know how much I believe that either. That I mean, perhaps there are some extremely petty individuals within the Russian Ministry of Defense, even going
Sure.
up to somebody like a Shoigu or any of the other high-ranking figures. Or once again, maybe it's somebody a bit down lower who
Yeah,
is,
Shogo was not military. He's civilian
yeah,
playing that
yeah,
role, just like
yes,
Prigozhin.
civilian appointed, yes. But whether it's him or whether it's somebody within the Russian Ministry of Defense, I could see a certain level of pettiness with that. When I first saw this, I thought it reflected very badly on the Russians, but then I realized upon a second or third viewing that this is more so theatrics than anything to really be that
Yeah.
concerned about. And once again, I will reiterate, it's one of those things that is far too intricate for the liberal who's watching CNN or MSNBC or whatever.
I
This
yeah.
isn't going to make Rachel Maddow, for example, because they
Hmm.
once again, like they know Putler bad, Ukraine good. They couldn't tell you Prigozhin is to save their life.
Right, and a lot of the Western press have glommed on to Prigozhin and what he says, looking for cracks, looking for ways to sustain the stories of corruption, and oh, they're gonna fall apart any moment now. Because like his tirade really does amplify every one of their points, right? Um, I mean, I just don't. I've heard nothing from Gerasimov or Shoigu. Like, Prigozhin is getting like very personal, especially about Shoigu's family, his daughter and such. I mean, and the guy that you expect to do something more like Sirovikin, nothing. Putin, nothing. Like there's no condemnation. I don't see it. I mean, if somebody has seen something in the chat, please let me know. Um, I myself have been very busy the last 48 hours, but in previous times there was never any um, retribution brought on uh, Prigozhin. The last time he did this, I admitted this is like off the scale, but um, and in some ways that kind of solidifies our point that we're trying to make that um, if any time would have been a good time to rein him in or fire him, or it would have been now. And now there's stories like, yeah, actually, we are going to say till the 10th. Like, what? And there's mixed reports. Akhmat Sila is there, it's not there. I did see, this is kind of off topic, but I did see one of the Akhmat Sila guys, and his armband is the armband of the icon of Jesus flag, where it's just the head. Sometimes it's
Yes.
usually a red background, but sometimes it's a black background. And so he's got this Orthodox Christian band, Because remember they made a video or two way back when the war started. We're Ahmad Sila. We're the army of Jesus Christ.
I
This
mean,
this war is something, man.
it is something, and once again, I know I talked about this Prigozhin rant as a microcosm of this war, but honestly, while many people are eager to hop on, and I'm not talking about people on our side, but the mainstream narrative is are eager to hop on, and this being some sort of redux of World War II, this war, in many ways, is a rejection of everything but technology, a rejection of the 20th and 21st centuries. Excuse me. It's a very
Mm.
19th century conflict fought with modern means and modern technology, and of course, modern media coverage, where so many of the things that you would have never seen from, let's just be fair, because sure there may be some things at the beginning of the 20th century that would bill anything from 1914 onward. These are things that you have not seen since until this war broke out, and even regardless of how this war ends, it has caused such a fundamental shift in terms of narrative, in terms of our perception of war, our perception of global politics, our perception of civilizations, that there's simply no going back to the post 1945 model of the world, even if Russia somehow is defeated and collapsed. Even a, for lack of a better word, triumphant American empire could not return to that post 1945 consensus.
Hmm. The other thing that I forgot to mention is um, you know, there was an attack. I mentioned it last week in uh, in the Dnepropetrovsk area. It was a town, I believe, called Pav Pavlovsk, and a munition place was hit, and it was burning for a day. And I was very surprised to see this, but there was a Western media outlet that covered it and showed satellite images. And the other thing that surfaced about this place is solid fuel was developed there for rocket engines during the Soviet times, and that the Ukrainians were using this area for quite a bit for like repair and storing of military material. That would include tanks, armored vehicles, infantry fighting vehicles, that sort of thing. So again, this was like a very big explosion. The photos that you saw were mostly from a distance, but I was very surprised to see that the Western press decided to cover it.
I would agree that it was pretty surprising to see the Western press cover this, and that there's really no. I it yeah, it's just shocking. Now, I suppose we can move on to some of the drone attacks that happened in both Crimea and Moscow over the past week, because those were a little bit out of left field for me personally, but it's ultimately not surprising. So I'll start with the ones in Crimea because they're far more simpler stories. So this has been something that's been going on for months now. The Ukrainian drone ranges, Ukrainian kamikaze drone ranges, have been able to hit targets in Crimea, particularly ammo depots and fuel depots.
Uh-huh.
And again, we showed some of the pictures on those attacks last episode, the ones that most recently hit Crimea. But now recently there was a drone attack that hit the Kremlin. Of course, it was claimed it was an attempt on Putin's life from the Russian narrative of it. Now, Putin was not at the Kremlin at the time. And of course, it's always easy to trump these things up, to uh, rally the base when something like this happens. They made an attempt on our leader. This is certainly going to be an escalation of the war, although we have seen plenty of retaliatory strikes. We haven't seen anything that could really constitute a substantial escalation of the war, at least in my estimation. Feel free to disagree, whether that be you or the audience, but it's from what I've seen thus far, and perhaps this will change as this week and that goes on and we see more of what happens in the future, that this really wasn't that substantial in my personal opinion, the response to this. But many people, and I am more inclined to agree with this claim, said this was an embarrassment for Russia that a drone was able to penetrate that far into Russia and attack it. Now, there were also the narratives that this was a Kremlin op, that they sent out one of their own drones to strike a harmless part of the Kremlin so they could claim this so they could escalate the war. Well, number one, we haven't seen that escalation. Number two, the Russian media narrative was not nearly fleshed out enough for this to be a proper false flag. And you could attribute that to the Russian propaganda apparatus not being as sophisticated as Western propaganda. But once again, even I think that, and look, I would agree the West has a superior propaganda apparatus, but even looking at all things, if this were going to be an op by the Russians on themselves, it doesn't follow with how much they did with
Mm-hmm.
it. So it was either
Mm-hmm.
very, very, very poorly executed op, or this was genuinely a Ukrainian attack. Now, the question is, if this came from Ukraine, on whose orders did it come from? Some people speculate that the Pentagon ordered them to do this, that was some Western force operating out of Ukraine that did this. Some speculated the orders came from Kiev themselves, and others speculated that it came from other parts of the Ukrainian government military that didn't necessarily go against Kiev's wishes, but didn't get their approval either, where it was a very ambiguous thing. Now, so far, the Pentagon, Biden, and the entire American Western apparatus has been adamant to Ukraine: don't strike into Russia proper, fight a defensive war, dislodge them from your territory, do whatever, but don't escalate this into Russia proper. And once again, Ukraine has been agitating to get missiles that have a striking distance that could hit Moscow for months now, actually since the beginning of this war, so for about a year and some change. And the West still has yet to provide those that could strike into all the way into Moscow. And I don't see them reversing their word on this, because although the West does have a very clear agenda on this war, Ukrainian strikes into Russia proper, especially into the heart of Russia, into Moscow, is not something that they would want. It is far more of an escalation than they would prefer. They want to keep this war a slow burn as possible, as much as they can milk out of Ukraine in order to grind down the Russians. They don't want to escalate it to any great degree. So, once again, I doubt these orders came from the West. My guess would probably be it was a military operation that didn't have the expressed approval or disapproval of Kiev by a certain sector of the Ukrainian military. And as for the hopes on that, I think it was to attempt to embarrass the Russians, to prod their air defenses, see what they're really up against. And I don't believe, despite whatever claims may be made by either side, that there was any attempts made on any of the Russian leadership, let alone Putin.
Yeah, I mean, uh, I have like I know that the drones have a lot of plastic parts, and I'm sure like one of the things that this war is teaching um, fighters on both sides is to use drones that have even more plastic so that they can't be found. Um, that said, it was two drones, and there's better. I believe one of them was hit like much further away. I could be wrong, but I only saw one actually get hit right over the dome. Right now, it should be said Putin wasn't there that day, and many have speculated uh, he's probably rarely there to begin with. And in any case, that drone is not strong enough to punch a hole through the ceiling, and then just by chance, Putin is right underneath that hole where the debris falls.
Yeah,
Like,
not at all.
um, this is strictly like it's an optics thing. Like, look, we're striking right in the heart of Moscow. Now, that said, it is an embarrassment. You would like you would not want that to happen. That would be the most preferable thing. Um, However, you know, he, I mean, Budanov has, he made that statement in reference to the attacks lately, the terrorist attack on Prilepin, and I suppose by extrapolation, so there are elements of the Ukrainian government, whether they did it or not, they have taken credit for it. Zelensky didn't do it, and ironically, Zelensky, like I think they did give the go ahead because Zelensky happened to leave that day, uh, just before the attack, so he was already out of the country in Finland, right? Um, and then you just have that weird story. He was in an interview a few days before the attack, where he says, "Oh yeah, I carry a pistol with me." You know, what were you gonna do with the pistol? He says, "Well, if me and like my entourage, were in danger, we were going to fight to the end." Like this is so bogus. Like we all know from Israeli intelligence that he, he already asked Bennett, who was president then, if Putin was going to kill him or not. He asked him twice.
You know,
Like,
I do have to wonder with Zelensky saying that he carries a firearm on his person. What do you think
yeah,
Zelensky carries?
I don't know, but the president of Czech Republic gave him the, an antique pistol.
you,
Like he did. It was an antique pistol.
you know what?
Like, is he saying you should kill yourself or time's running out? Like, what does he mean by that?
I I mean that's look, when somebody gives you an antique pistol, as cool and as unique
Mm,
as it might look, it's never a good sign. But honestly, if I'm going to speculate on irrelevant minutia, I'm going to say that Zelensky took a leaf out of Saddam's playbook and carries a gold-plated Browning high power.
yeah, yeah.
I could see Zelensky carrying something along that. Either that or he carries one of those really overpriced, really overhyped Israeli pistols, but
Hmm.
and that's not just because he's Jewish. It's just because that's the kind of person I imagine he is. But I'm getting sidetracked here. But I the antique Czech pistol.
Yeah, it's hilarious, right? And anyhow, I just think all these stories, like, I mean, they are obsessed with optics, right? Because they have to keep the Western public engaged. Like they can't lose interest now. Maybe it is that they can't lose interest right now, because of course we know that the American public can lose interest like very quickly, and a war can go on for 20 years, and they just don't care. Um, the only time they kind of care is when it hurts them economically. Um, so you know, like I don't. Maybe let me rephrase it. I think it's more important for the EU country populations to keep them engaged than the American, right? One, just because of the proximity. Two, because that's the populations that America is most afraid of losing um, attention. Because it's one thing, to be 6, 7,000 miles away with an ocean separating you. It's another to be, I don't know, 1,000 miles, 500 miles on the same continent, all kinds of dark history between you and these countries, and so on. To lose interest, that would be bad. Um, so I just think like a lot of this was. I have no doubt that the Ukrainian government said, "Okay, yeah." I mean, what does Zelensky always do? He denies it, and then later on, they say yes, right? Um, Now, I know this is a question of the stamp. This after it happened, there's a stamp of a of a Ukrainian soldier giving the finger to the Kremlin, and in the background over the wall of the Kremlin is a fire raging, right? Like it's one of their fantasies that they have, and they've had them for a very long time. And I've shown you
I need
the
to see if I can find it. But that reminds me of that one Russian political
yeah, the
cartoon where
children's book from
Uh,
2014 when
have you seen
Moscow
the
is
one
burning.
where Obama has the Ukrainian man and he's charging the Kremlin wall with the Ukrainian man as a battering ram?
Yeah,
I,
yeah.
I I need to find that and I need to show that on the show one of these days because honestly, if you replace Obama with Brandon, that's exactly what this war is right now. That's one of my I hate political cartoons, but that is one of the few ones that I would like absolutely give credit for is the Obama using Volodymyr, and that's not Volodymyr Zelensky. That's just the archetypical Volodymyr as a battering ram against the Kremlin. uh, that's some of the stuff is just too good. And well, I suppose on a more serious note, we should probably get on to some of the news about the counteroffensive. And you were alluding to this a bit earlier in the show, so I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, so the numbers for what they expect the counteroffensive to be have has grown. Um, um, a brigade can be 3,000 to 5,000, and people were estimating that these nine brigades at 4,000 each should be around 48,000, give or take. All right, roughly speaking. So now I'm seeing from Western press that the counteroffensive is going to be, as I said earlier, close to 70,000. I mean, by the looks of it, if they want, like the Russians have already begun to clear villages that are very close to the front line. That began in the last 48 hours, as we record. I believe maybe it was yesterday, the first time actually that I saw that. But that process is still going on now. So, this is kind of it's making a lot of some Russians very uneasy because they remember what happened last time when they started to clear people out of Kherson and said, "Oh, no, no, don't worry, they're not going to give up Kherson." And so I would say though this time, I mean, Zaporozhye is not like Kherson, and I'll tell you why. For one, there's nothing if you if you lose that part of the middle of Zaporozhye, you've only got the Azov Sea, and retaking it will be very difficult. The other thing is um, that makes it different is why would you invest build so many trenches, dragon's teeth, pillboxes? Why would you do so much of this? 3 layers, some areas 4 layers deep, if like you were just going to give it to them. I strongly doubt that. So I do think just by deduction, um, and I think it would just destroy Russian morale if they did that again. I just do.
Yeah, I
Um,
agree, and I think what you're getting at, and I also agree with this, is that after the two mobilization drives the Russians have done, bolstering their numbers about 150,000 from that alone, as well as forces from other areas, they actually do have proper numbers and supplies to actually hold a line against the Ukrainians. Not that it won't be costly, not that they won't suffer a significant amount of casualties to hold this line, but ultimately looking at it as just raw numbers, unfortunately to divorce from the human cost, which I don't want to, but just looking at it purely analytically, the Russians do have the numbers and supplies to hold off a Ukrainian
mhm.
counteroffensive until the Ukrainians can exhaust themselves.
Yeah, I do think that is the strategy. Now, the guys at the Duran, particularly Mercurius, believes that the Russians, after particularly if it goes very well for the Russians, that is, if they stop the counteroffensive effectively, they are eventually going to do some big arrow moves and consolidate more territory. So, I mean, I don't know. It's a possibility. Then there's the counter argument, but guys like Sloboda who will say, "I don't think that's important." Because they would need more men. Now there's still like 160,000 troops that they've not like let in to the war, so roughly half of like the mobilized forces are not there. And why are they not there? Well, Sloboda still believes that the Russian government um, and the military are convinced that there still will be eventually a war between Russia and America proper. That Because like one of the things I always said, like if this war happens, it's everything's at stake. Um, I would write nothing off because, as we've seen now, because this war has gone on for so long, the likelihood of like America going against China, I think, just dwindles every day, and that's primarily because I'm beginning. Do they have the amount of material and men they would need to do that? And at this moment, if I'm to believe what they've been saying and what the evidence seems to suggest, that's not the case. They can't do that. And now they're talking about sending in forces to Sudan and extending and increasing their stay in Somalia. That's right. They never left Somalia. They've been in Somalia over 30 years.
And that's
So,
also on top of the current saber rattling with Iran, which has been extremely stifled by the Chinese led talks between Saudi Arabia and Iran, to the point
mm,
where they're trying to really entrench themselves in the last Gulf strongholds they have, like the UAE, like Qatar, neither of which they have particularly good relationships with, but at least the UAE they have a decent one with. Bahrain, it's really too small to be any resistance to the American empire, so the Fifth Fleet is, for the time being, safe there. But especially with Netanyahu and his slipping legitimacy, a strike on Iran does become more and more likely. Now, I'm not saying it will happen because I think there's far too much at stake in order to have a potentially embarrassing failure on either America or Israel's part involving any sort of strike in Iran. But if desperate enough, I could see either country, if not both countries, in unison launching some sort of strike against
mhm.
Iran in order to at least save face.
Yeah. If they had to go in a war against China, like they would have to be so effective in such a short time before the industrial complex of the equation of a protracted war would begin to interfere. So it would have to be so impressive that the Chinese say, okay, 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 fine, fine, fine. We'll tell Russia to back off. We'll do this. We'll do that. We're going to make concessions to you, right? That's what would have to happen, and I don't see that happening.
I would agree. And I'm not saying that even if they were to go forward with these strikes on Iran, that they would have their intended goal, even if they were to succeed. At the end of the day, it would just be a show of force that they probably could not follow up on. They probably could not have a sustained campaign against the Iranians on that front. And really, and we'll talk about this later on the show, that leaves Taiwan is the last place where they can really saber rattle against the enemies of the American Empire. In which case, that's also not that much more of an optimistic prospect when it comes to this, despite the fact whatever comes out of the Pentagon, or whatever. I mean, possibly the Korean Peninsula, there has been tensions rising there, but you run into many of the same problems you do in Taiwan as well. In fact, I do think tensions breaking on into war on the Korean Peninsula is actually more of a likelihood than any sort of
Hmm.
military engagement over Taiwan that involves the U.S. I'm not saying that China and Taiwan wouldn't have a military conflict, but I'm just saying if the U.S. were to get involved in any conflict in East Asia right now, I do think it would be a reignited Korean War.
Yeah, I do too. It would be a scenario where not too much of American military would have to be invested.
Yes, and especially given the size and ability of the South Korean military, a lot of the burden could be put on them with a much smaller amount of American support, even if there were American boots on the ground. For example, a Chinese American war over Taiwan would require a draft. It would require driving the country into total war. Whereas a North Korea South Korea war, even with an active American involvement, would not require a draft and would not require that much more economic sacrifice from the American population because the peninsula is already so militarized on both sides, and the American presence on Korea is already it's been at war readiness since the first ceasefire.
Yeah.
So, and once again, I'll talk more about some of the East Asia stuff later, but the American empire is really running out of fronts to grandstand on because Syria is more or less a done deal. We'll get into some of the news about that. Iran, we just discussed this. Ukraine is falling apart before their very eyes. Once again, funny enough, and I don't know if funny is exactly the right word, but strangely enough, I think is more appropriate, that Korea seems to be the last place where you could actually see an active U.S. military involvement with the current state of things.
Just a couple of things that I think are just interesting to say about you know, the big Ukrainian counteroffensive. Just a few details. One is Siersky has said that it's not time yet. It has begun to rain again in Ukraine. Um, the other is there's a lot of talk about like what happens after the counteroffensive. So I think like even if it fails, like don't there's no way the Americans are just going to stop funding this. I just think that's all BS. Um, what they're going to do is uh, continue to fund Ukraine. Now, it might be in smaller packages, but it depends on how heavy Ukraine's losses are. In the news, again, the president of Czech Republic has suggested that they not do this, which is strange, considering that he was an officer in NATO at one point. He wasn't just like, and he was
He
also
was
a
top brass in
minister.
NATO.
Yeah, yeah, top brass, and he was the minister during the Soviet Union in the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia. So
You have to love
he's
how
not.
fickle these people's loyalties are.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, it's all ideal. BS, BS. Therefore, I rule. So, um, yeah. So I would say like people should prepare like themselves that there are going to be areas where the Ukrainians will break through, and like that, not to panic over that because they have a force now that I would say conservatively is 60,000, and optimistically it's 70,000. Not including whatever amount of mercenaries are going to be joining them. Now, they've made a lot of big, big statements from guys like Reznikov and others
I'm sorry, I can
who've
never
literally
hear any
said,
of these guys' names without thinking of that Emil Cosman clip from this week.
I
Zelensky,
know what you're
Jewish,
talking about.
Reznikov, Jewish. Oh, it's the man never ceases to amaze me. Once again, has quickly become one of my favorite people on YouTube. Once again, cannot recommend him enough. Emil Cosman puts my content to shame in both quality and quantity.
Yes. Um, he said this offensive is going to be very spectacular. And what it's going to do is it's going to put the Russian army into a panic, and implying that in a cascade effect, it will cause the Russian population to go into a panic. And we will take back Crimea through diplomacy because it will be
Yes.
the attack will be so tremendous, so unexpected for the Russians
Okay,
that
I just want to bring up this point because I cannot think of anything else, and I want your opinion and the audience's opinion when they do finally hear this. So, from my look, I like history. I like to study history, but by no means am I an expert. I'm simply a student of history, as cliche as that might sound, but I hold to that. And insofar as my understanding, since the Russians obtained Crimea, is in the late 18th century. The only time they have ever ceded it in any sort of formal agreement was Brest-Litovsk after their dropping out of World War One. And no
Mhm.
other time, not even during the Crimean War, not during any other conflict, even when they had suffered embarrassing defeats, did they ever cede Crimea except under the Bolshevik government. And under
Yes.
what circumstances is anyone else going to cede Crimea? Uh, what is Putin going to? Are they going to overthrow Putin and put down Medvedev? I mean, Medvedev. I know it's a lot of it's probably just uh, just rhetoric, but he is trying to take the further right line. But who conceivably in Russian leadership that is either currently in Russian leadership or could be in the next regime if this one were to implode would ever cede Crimea before ending the world in nuclear hellfire? That's my question. And I'm not saying that
Hmm.
rhetorically. I genuinely want to know who these people think would put pen to paper to give up Crimea.
Yeah, yeah. So, I don't know why they make statements like this, to be honest.
I mean, they kind of
Like
have to.
I
What
think
else
I
are they
think
going to
what they
say?
wanted, like my brother and I were talking about this. They want to, like, it's kind of like Trump in a way, like, our enemies, um maybe they believe the rhetoric that Trump was memed into office. And I think they believe that, like, they can meme these results, right? Because that is why they're doing more and more terrorist attacks, right? They want to
White
establish,
girl
like,
manifesting. We're going to manifest Crimea back to Ukraine.
yeah, yeah.
Ugh, disgusting.
um
I'm
yeah,
sorry.
so it is kind of funny to me that that they're doing this. I don't know what to say. Like, I mean, I don't know. Maybe they will be successful. I don't know, but I think the likelihood is not there. Um,
No, once again, they
that
would
that
need to
that's just me.
completely implode Russia. They would need their fantasy partition maps in order to ever wrestle Crimea away from it. They had a few month window to get their foot in the door in Crimea
Yeah.
from November 2013 to February 2014. And after that, it was Russia's. There are no ifs, ands, or buts about it. Either you need to start a direct military confrontation with Russia, hope they bumble into one with Ukraine before they're ready and collapse themselves, or you're just not getting Crimea back. And it's at the point where I cannot imagine under any realistic scenario, even of Russian defeat. I'm talking not these fantasies that you get from that one guy. Who's the one guy who keeps getting his phone number doxed on Telegram? The one Austrian guy,
Oh yeah,
Gunther,
the gay
whatever.
guy who's always
Wonderful.
trolling the Serbians.
Yeah, yeah, he has this undying hatred of Serbia and is so disappointed in Austria for looking out for its own economic interests, and despite everything. But look, barring the scenarios of people like him and the fantasies of people like him, there is no realistic scenario, even under what would be considered a Russian defeat, where Crimea is ceded. And I'm even talking real negotiations where Russia does give up significant concessions, say maybe even the Donbass. But
Hmm.
under no scenario is there going to be Crimea ceded. And it's going to get to a point, and I speculated long before this war happened, now this was under much different circumstances, that so long as the West accepts that Russia is still a legitimate state, which we'll see how that goes as time goes on, we could just see a complete withdrawal from any sort of dialogue or any sort of acknowledgement of Russia as a state. They will, in order to continue to recognize Russia as a state, if they want to go forward with that, will have to, at least in some form, even if it's just implicit, even if they don't put pen to paper, will have to recognize that Crimea is Russian territory. I mean, even before the war, they did. They operated under that. And in fact, even during the war, when it comes to the limitations that the Pentagon puts on the Ukrainian forces, Crimea is often one of them where they say, try to take Crimea at your own risk. We're not going to back you up on this one. So everyone implicitly acknowledges that Crimea is a territory of Russia.
Hmm.
But that's all the thoughts I had on that wonderful little peninsula. Um, perhaps I'm incriminating myself under some sort of law, but I really don't care. On if the circumstances ever do allow, I actually would love to visit Crimea one day. It does actually look like a very lovely place to be.
I've bought the semi-famous wine from Crimea that the guys on Russians with Attitude talk about. It.
I mean,
I brought it back. My dad was very impressed.
if my friend, our friend, I should say, friend of the show, Vile Varangian, is to be believed, if all goes well, I will have my Crimean beach house before the end of the decade. So
Mm.
I'm looking forward to that. I would love to live in such a place. It's my kind of climate. Maybe a touch cold for my taste, but like I'll just I would take Crimea over most places. I'll just put it that way. And look,
Yeah.
if I were ever exiled to Russia, I'd want to live in Crimea. And that's all I'd say. I have a great deal of affection for this peninsula. What else can I say? The last thing I will add on.
Oh,
Go ahead.
here's what I wanted to say about. I'm sorry.
No, no, please do.
So one of the things that particularly Kuleba has been saying is after the offensive, we're definitely going to get the F-16s. And remember back in January, February, we were saying, like, if anything, they're going to get like a lot of the fancy new shiny stuff after the offensive.
Oh,
Because
absolutely.
at the moment they have like 60 Western tanks, but I believe 40 of the 60 are actually just the Leopard 1s, and we've already established the Leopard 1s are even slightly inferior to the T-64s because they don't have a smooth bore. However, they do have, and this is not a joke, they have 1,500 Modars and Bradley infantry fighting vehicles. But the Bradley is a solid machine, especially the updated version.
Oh yes,
It's not a
and
joke.
I've never been one to discount some of the older military technology just because it's older, because I do think when we get full scale conventional wars, much like this one in Ukraine is now, you're starting to realize why
Hmm.
these countries do stockpile even the older stuff. Because in a pinch, it does work. Because if it maneuvers, if it fires, it's a functional weapon. And a lot of this obsession with high tech has been a result of American foreign policy for the past 30 years. These interventions, where of course we can have the multi-billion-dollar aircraft project that's known as the F-35. It's not like we're ever going to see dogfights with it. We're just going to strike random targets in Iraq and Syria with it. What's the big deal? And also
Yeah,
touching
exactly.
on the shiny toys that Ukraine is getting, I know that there's been some cries that, oh, give them the F-35, whatever. Honestly, I will say, in defense of a decision of the Pentagon, at least objectively speaking, not necessarily aligning with my personal views or values, but speaking purely objectively, the F-16, honestly, I swear, I completely believe this with my, albeit limited knowledge about aircraft and combat aircraft, the F-16 would be superior in this kind of war to the F-35.
Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely.
It
Absolutely.
because it's a functional aircraft with a proven combat record, and not a toy the Pentagon threw together because they need to justify their own budgets. And it's really that
Hmm.
simple. And probably now, look, maybe as some of the fifth generation fighters that come out of Russia may prove this wrong. I mean, currently, right now, in my opinion, the F-22 is probably the greatest fighter aircraft in the world. They stopped manufacturing it for some reason. I don't know why. It's certainly superior to the F-35, and it's a perfectly functional fifth generation fighter. So I don't know what the obsession is with the F-35 and why they completely decided to ditch the F-22 Raptor. But point being is, a lot of these toys are just that. They're toys. They're projects by the Pentagon. And when it comes to the kind of war that we're probably going to see throughout the 21st century, because I think Ukraine is only a sign of things to come, whether that be in other places in Europe or other parts of the world, that we will see a more of a return to conventional wars. Because at least thus far, now we're only a year and a quarter into it, Ukraine has shown us that you can have a conventional war between two fairly sized militaries. And look, I'm not going to downplay Ukraine. They're one of the largest countries in Europe. They had one of the largest military stockpiles from the fall of the Soviet Union. Not as large as Russia, of course, but two conventional powers can fight without it turning hot. Now, if the West were to get involved, that would be entirely another question. And for example, the Korean Peninsula would be another question. As I mean, even though once again there is that disparity there, where you have one nuclear armed power versus a non-nuclear armed power, so you might not get that. But I do think this also, once again, to return to this, and a point that I really want to try to drive home here, and I'll touch on later in the show, that I think the kind of war we see in Ukraine actually very much resembles the kind of war that we could potentially see in Korea within the next, I would say, 15 years, just to give a um, just a baseless time frame, just to put an idea in your mind.
Hmm. Yeah. Just slightly off topic, but I think like I totally concur with all those points. Um, a lot of the stealth bombers, that's what they are, is stealth strike bomber, basically. Um, a lot of the stealth fighters still are not as maneuverable. Even the F-22 compared to the F-16 is a strike aircraft. It has just one tail. right? These are they're kind of like a race car. They're any amount of input will, they're always slightly, how can I put it, off center, right? But it's what gives them great maneuverability. I know you love planes, but I have a soft spot for the British. Um, what is it? They just stopped producing it. It has folding wings.
Oh, that's not the
Tornado.
yeah the tornado.
It's kind of clunky, but it's also kind of elegant in a certain way.
It's very
Like
British. I'll put it that way.
it's very British. It has almost like an 80s or 90s steampunk quality to it. Like it reminds me of some of the futuristic comic books that were around in the 80s. Like just the lines. Anyways, I don't mean to go like off topic, but
Oh no,
I
if you
did
want to talk
find
about
the
planes, we can
article.
do an entire show on planes. But that's maybe that needs to happen at some point. But
So I do remember the name of that town. It's Pavlograd. So Pavlograd was hit. This is the one where they even published like satellite photos, but even I think in many ways more interesting was that Newsweek ran an article who used a former British intelligence officer, Philip Ingram, to describe what had happened there. The attack highlights the importance of ammunition depots and defense industry facilities. It may have affected the preparations for the Ukrainian armed forces for their counter offensive. According to the article, Russian aviation hit a key facility involved in the testing of Ukrainian anti-ship Neptune missiles, as well as the Olha M rockets. By the way, the 3 weeks ago, the Ukrainians published a video that showed like them launching the very missile that took out the Moskva. Like, but it's in daylight, and like if you calculate the distance from where they claimed they launched it and how long it would take there, the sun would have been down. Like the Moskva got hit like just after sundown, right? And they're showing a launch that was clearly like, first of all, it was a cloudy day that they showed the launch, and it was too early. It's just the video doesn't make sense. Like they spliced it, and remember I said like I honestly think the Brits had something to do with it, right? People started to think maybe it's the Neptune rocket that they're using, and remember the British were going to supply them with Neptune rockets. I just don't like this was not like if you saw the rocket launcher, the idea that it came from this thing, which like looks like a step above a grad, like it's a joke. That's no way that this was a more sophisticated missile traveling at a faster velocity, and it would have been done at a different time. And probably the reason there is no video is because it was already dark or getting dark, not because it was already bright and then it got hit in the dark. Like, anyways, it's ridiculous. It didn't even gain any traction because I think everybody just kind of saw that it was stupid.
yes, and I will just say that while there's plenty more to discuss in Ukraine, we do also have a lot of other topics. And because there's actually not that much out of Europe this week, I will just briefly read over some of the things that are happening there. I'm not going to dedicate too much time. So, you do have continued agricultural issues with grain coming out of both Russia and Ukraine, where Poland has banned Russian grains within Poland and has also pushed for the European Union to ban imports of Russian grains, which, once again, looking at the
Hmm.
supply disparities, is yet another thing that would completely cripple Europe. You have similar issues going on with the Dutch agricultural industry, where the government there is trying to crack down hard on Dutch farmers. Yet again, that it has continued to happen. Tensions are rising in Bosnia with the Republika Srpska, and the story that we covered about Dodik with his declarations about putting up border defenses and wanting to peacefully leave Bosnia and Herzegovina, that rhetoric has continued. There are renewed tensions in Kosovo. There were, and perhaps I will cover this next episode, but at this time I will just briefly mention there were those shootings in Serbia, which were very surprising and shocking to say the least. And finally, I have that despite everything, the EU is still snubbing Georgia on membership because of the recent unrest
Hmm.
in the country. Once again, one of these countries that has been completely compliant, but because Georgia is not completely on board with Russian sanctions because there are just far too many pragmatic business interests there, they're still being completely snubbed from the European Union despite the once again one of the earliest color revolutions. We're talking all the way back in what 2003 was the Rose Revolution. And then there was also the one in '08, which really solidified that with the Russian Georgia War. But you do have the European Union continuing to spiral where they can tolerate no real dissent within the organization. But not that much news out of Europe this week. Next week, I will certainly have more, but it's been pretty quiet in Europe as of the
Hmm.
past 8 to 10 days, I would say. If you have anything that I missed, certainly feel free to mention it.
About the Green Deal, the only thing I can say is I'm not saying trust the Turkish opposition party, but they seem like to agree at least with Erdogan's party on this grain issue. It looks like Turkey is losing patience with the West. Notice that Turkey's been quiet about this more or less, not wanting to get into the fray for about a year, but they seem to be echoing Russia's frustration with this grain deal. So just something I didn't expect would happen.
Yes, and I don't know, the Turkish elections are shaping out to be interesting insofar as neither the opposition nor the current ruling party under Erdogan really have that much of a difference in foreign policy, which is primarily what I'm interested in right now. You could argue the biggest difference is the Kemalist opposition is a bit more belligerent towards other NATO states, which might cause some tension there with the issue over some of the Aegean Islands and the bordering regions with Greece and Bulgaria. And I mean, that's not even to get into the Cyprus question because I think the Cyprus question is, I'm not going to say it's solved, but I think it is solidly frozen over, and it would take a lot in order for that issue to become readdressed on either side of it. But insofar as the main issue right now, which is the Russian-Ukrainian war and the fallout from that, for example, the grain deal, it does seem that there is a uniparty consensus in Turkey, so to speak, on those issues.
Hmm.
But I will say one thing about the Turkish elections that I found quite entertaining: that Erdogan did levy quite an accusation against the members of opposition parties, and he simply said the opposition is gay. His words, not mine.
Yes, that's right.
Which I have to say, love him or hate him, powerful political rhetoric. You can't fault the guy. Look, I'm just gonna say, I've said it many times before. Personally, I can never co-sign Erdogan. I can never co-sign any Turkish politician for that matter. I can never co-sign any action of the Turkish state for that matter. And look, I'm going to get pretty drastic here, but Erdogan is good at his job and he's a good leader. I would love for my country. I would love for many countries to have leaders like Erdogan because love or hate the man, he's good at his job and he's good at advancing the position in interests of Turkey. And also, apparently he's taken once again. Not even Trump would have gone as far as to say my opponents are gay. So it's even better than that. So look, love him or hate him, objectively speaking, credit where credit is due on both those points.
Hmm. Hmm. I
But
should mention,
yeah, go ahead.
just going through my notes, they did detain a guy that was trying to plant a device in Crimea. He was caught. Formerly, he there was responsible for an attack on a railroad system in, I believe, Bryansk. Um, anyways, just but honestly, this is happening. Like it's a constant thing that the Russians are having to deal with.
Yes, it is, and there's probably not going to be a clear solution anytime in the future. I know that's a very common answer for these kind of things, but you can't really see anything along those lines really having any sort of resolution in the near future, and that its resolution
Hmm.
will come once again with the end of the war with something like this. And unfortunately, this is just something that's going to have to be borne by the Russian state and people for the time being, and that there's not much else that can really be done to immediately rectify the issue. Now, there are things that can be done to take measures against it, but at the end of the day, it's something that's going to be endemic to the idea of a Russian-Ukrainian war. That there will be these sort of actions that do continue to happen.
Hmm.
But with that, I would say before we get into some of the Korea and Taiwan stuff, we do have quite a bit of Middle Eastern news, starting with Saudi Arabia and Iran have continued their reconciliations. So, what we have here is, once again, the Chinese led peace efforts have continued. And you had the Saudi chiefs of staff wishing the Iranian delegation a safe trip, saying that the Iranians are welcome back anytime because they've been having constant meetings. They've been meeting with each other, sending delegations to each other's countries, constantly meeting in third party countries. I know traditionally Oman has been the bridge between the two, and now that relations are thawing at a rate that I don't think anyone would have ever anticipated, even if they would have anticipated reconciliation, it's it's really quite remarkable. This is something that has.
Hmm.
This is. Look, I know the war in Ukraine takes front and center stage for obvious reasons. I'm not saying that's not important at all. It's very important. But these are the kind of events that do get pushed in the background that 20, 30, 40 years down the line will be cited as the pivotal moments in which the balance of power shifted away from America. And there's. Look, I know a lot of people really bought into the Turbo America thing, to borrow the term from, I think it was Soldo who was pushing that back. I mean, even he has. I'm not going to say speak for the man, but even he has gone back on some of that just based on. I keep up somewhat with his works. I would certainly recommend it, even though I'd say I disagree with quite a bit of it. He still does offer pretty good analysis and opinions on a lot of these situations. So,
Yeah, he's got good analysis on other stuff.
yeah, yeah,
But you know what? All the bank failures, that's part of Turbo America. That too is part of Turbo America. Just the plan.
I mean, well, like I said, agree or disagree with him. I do think he's somebody worth keeping up with in terms of ideas. I do think, unlike a lot of people, he actually, even if once again I'll say that I think a lot of it I frankly shake my head at. It still is worth reading from a certain
Yeah, yeah. He's
perspective.
no,
Um,
he's good. He's solid.
oh
He's
yeah,
solid.
certainly.
And
That's what
actually,
I'm looking for.
I mean, I have a friend of mine that knows him personally, that has met up with him. So it's not like that. Yeah, I just think he was wrong about that. And way back this one time, I made a post and he quote tweeted me and he said some
No, no,
stuff and
not
it's
Twitter
like,
drama. Not Twitter drama.
I've not forgiven him. I have not forgiven that Croat, and I never will.
The blood feuds. They're so vile and aggressive sometimes. But we're getting sidetracked here. So
Yeah,
as I was saying, this is the kind of thing that is extremely pivotal. This is the kind of thing that, if this is not completely sabotaged, if this does not completely fall through, if there is a genuine lasting peace between Saudi Arabia and Iran, which will come with economic cooperation under the umbrella of China, because once again, even if there are the outstanding disagreements, once they become economically integrated enough, I'm going to sound like a neoliberal here, but fundamentally they do have a point that economic integration does prevent a great deal of conflict. And especially with nations of those calibers, especially with nations of those size, if they become cooperative enough, it's going to be too lucrative to break the cycle on either side to escalate the violence. That's not saying some
yeah,
degree of proxy war won't continue, but I do think, especially with the way the Saudis have realigned themselves, it has become far more in their interest to have a much more stable region. Whereas under the American Empire, when they were solidly in the camp of the American Empire, it was a very good business model to inflame the wars in Syria, Yemen, etc. It They couldn't have asked for more. It put them right in the position they wanted to be. But now that tensions have grown, especially with Mohammed bin Salman coming to more prominence, and he hasn't even taken the throne yet, mind you, it has become a far more harsh and difficult situation between the Saudis and the Americans. And I do wonder if Trump 2024 can throw a wrench in this, because honestly, I don't put that much stock in Trump's foreign policy, so to speak. And once again, I fully admit that my support for Trump comes entirely from the fact that he is a spectacle, that he will just be absurd. Not that I think he'll necessarily do anything within our favor. Now, maybe some of the absurdity will lead to some things going right for
They're
us, but
addicted to optics, right? And he's very
yes,
bad optics, and
exactly.
that they find that very disturbing because look at any time you know I'm sorry for the language, but just bad shit goes down. What do they do? What do all Western countries do? They block it out. They do a media spin. They just never address it. Like things can only go their way, their direction. It's only their agenda, nobody else's agenda. No step backwards. Yeah. I just think um, Trump is dangerous for them because it's such a bad look. I mean, Biden is claiming he's going to send 1,000 troops to the border. Remind you of anybody?
No, nobody at all. But fundamentally, the point I am getting at, and once again, I do agree that Trump is the anti-optics candidate, which is the basis of my support for him. Just at the end of the day, it really comes down to something as simple as that. That any hope of stifling what's going on in the Middle East, I'm not saying this would happen, but I'm saying the best chance they have, which is still a bad chance, but it's the best chance they have, is Trump getting back there with Netanyahu and whoever else and trying to salvage the Abraham Accords to some degree. But
Hmm.
once again, as Israel shows itself to be more politically unstable, as Netanyahu shows himself to be less and less serious of a player, as well as other Israeli politicians, because I don't really think there's any real. I hate the phrase, but for lack of a better term, I don't think there's any real adult in the room in Israel when it comes to this, because the country's just become just too politically dysfunctional. At the end of the day, that's the only thing that could happen, but especially with the Chinese in the region and with Chinese economic and diplomatic policy overseeing the region, breaking
Hmm.
Saudi Arabia and the Peninsula, for that matter, the Gulf states, from Iran after this reconciliation happens is going to be exceedingly difficult. And that's also to add to that, Syria has been officially readmitted back into the Arab League today, over this past week.
Yes, that's
It
right.
actually came yesterday. That came on Saturday. So that has been in talks for a while, but it has been officiated, and Syria and Saudi Arabia are on the path to also normalizing relations. Once again, Saudi Arabia, along with Turkey and the U.S. and the other sort of Western powers, were behind, and not to mention Israel, of course, behind the attempts at regime change in Syria. And now that has been completely reconciled. Even Mohammed bin Salman, who was very supportive of the waves of strikes that took place in Syria and very supportive of the Syrian opposition very early on, has completely withdrawn this. And you also have to consider he's reversed his position on the war in Yemen as well, and the war in Yemen is starting to draw down on the Saudi side. So that is yet another thing where the two big conflicts that the U.S. really had their investment in the region, Syria and Yemen, are being brought to a close diplomatically outside of their influence.
Yeah. The president of Iran visited Syria, I think 3 days ago, 4 days ago. I believe it was on the 3rd or the 4th of May. I mean, you've got Sullivan and others going to Saudi Arabia, trying to get them to reconsider. They've even interfered with prisoner exchanges between the Houthi forces in Yemen and Saudi Arabia. Like that's how far they're going with this. It's like, dude, nobody wants you. Like nobody's stopping you from being Turbo America in America.
I mean, and that's the last place they really can be Turbo America, except that, and I guess Europe and Canada as well. But once again, that's all under the same umbrella. What hope of resistance do they have? In fact, it's funny because I've mentioned this time and time again. There's a certain hyper Americanism that exists both in Canada and the European states where they will, in attempts to thumb their noses, especially when there's a Republican office, to thumb their noses at the Americans. they will go further down the line of American degeneracy than the Americans themselves will, which is a
Yeah.
very self-destructive policy. I've touched on this before. I think Canada is probably the worst offender, but the other Anglosphere states are certainly up there as well, and Germany, France, Scandies, and even some
I mean,
parts.
we still don't
Yeah,
have a trans. We don't have a transvestite who's trying to get more men to join the Navy.
does Canada even have a navy at this point?
We have two ships. I think one of them did the laundry
Ah,
for the second Iraq War for the
okay.
Americans.
That
I'm not kidding you.
that follows. That follows. Uh, but once again, it's this very cancerous hyper-Americanism that exists within America's satellite states, where they voluntarily participate in their own self-destruction because the Republicans are unoptical. That's really what it comes down to. Whether that's Bush, whether that's Trump, whoever else, and even like somebody like a DeSantis, who's very milquetoast in my opinion. Even if he were to get in office, it's this very self-destructive cycle. And look, I maybe not so much the Canadians, but I want to be on the team of the Europeans. I want to be rooting for them. But, and look, I understand there are other extenuating circumstances at hand, and by no means am I ever going to justify the presence of the American Empire there. But after a certain point, they are complicit in this. That they are either too blind or there's some sort of barrier there that prevents them from seeing this for what it really is. And look, I'm not saying that breaking from the American Empire is realistic. And honestly, to reference Turkey, I think any wise state that's stuck under the thumb of the American Empire would behave like Turkey. And look, I'm France, Germany, they're certainly capable of this. But anytime they even come close to behaving like Turkey, they fall right back in line. Macron's eating lobster with American cheese.
Hmm. Um, you know, we've been meaning to say that. I've been meaning to say this, and I always tell you after shows, but we should say just a little bit of the technological war that Russia is waging against the American technology in the battlefield of Ukraine, and that is, you know, Musk came out a few weeks ago and said that he had lost some of his satellites permanently to Russians jamming them. And then the Russians said that they shot down the first JDAM missile by launched by the Ukrainians. And then there was an article in an American paper, like I mean, one of the mainline papers. I cannot remember whether it was the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times or Newsweek, but they said that
Just
effective.
pick one. Just
Yeah. Anyhow, they said that effectiveness of the HIMARS has been greatly reduced. Something actually we've known for months. I don't know if they made a if they claimed that this was one of the leaks again. And you know, the leaks thing was, I think, designed to fool the Russians, and it didn't. And if Prigozhin was doing a stunt to fool the Ukrainians, well, then it worked a little bit. Whatever. But also, some of the guided bombs that the Ukrainians have been using, the Russians have been able to get at least 4 out of 9 of those bombs to completely miss the target. Um, so that's interesting that they have adapted very quickly. There was an article about that as well. So, anyways, I just wanted to get that out of the way.
I'm glad you
Thank
mentioned
you.
that because I know that you've been meaning to get that on the show, and I do
And
think
I
it's
always forget.
I do think that that's certainly worthwhile. And the last piece of Middle Eastern news I'll leave you with before we get into some of the more enticing stuff coming out of East Asia right now is that there have been American forces who have been clamoring for dogfights with the remaining Russian air presence in Syria to test them to see what they'd really be up against with the Russian Air Force. Which, I mean, it's an absurd story, but I do think it's worth mentioning just in its absurdity. But that's really all I had for the Middle East, unless you have any last minute things that I had left out of there.
Uh, Honestly, not too much. Uh, it's basically the same old. In the last week or two, the Syrians have managed to knock out some ISIS members of the Americans, or these are probably guys also from Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. Um, you know, the back and forth of them killing each other, and there were another 26 civilians that were killed. again, going after those truffles from early last week. So,
Yeah, that's. I mean, this news has become routine out of Syria. Not to downplay the human cost here, but it's you start to honestly lose track with how just senseless this has become. And I guess, especially with both Saudi Arabia and Turkey really giving second guesses to the conflict, that there may be an end in sight to this, and especially also with the Kurdish forces looking to come to the table to reconcile with the Syrian government, that there might be something of a clean end to this. And believe it or not, against my own better judgment, I am somewhat optimistic that Syria can come to a relatively peaceful conclusion.
mm. Yeah, I guess yeah. The only thing I'll say is that the Turks are, they're supposed to be meeting with the Syrians in Moscow this week.
Yes,
Um,
and even
but they still want this chunk of Syria. It will go back to Syria, but we have to be there just to make sure those Kurds don't give us any trouble, right? Um, the problem with this scenario is the Kurds are not likely to back down now if they leave, and I think the Turks know that. So this makes peace there, I think, very difficult. If they would have to, I mean, it would have to be an agreement between the Turks and the Syrians to appease the Kurds to some degree in order to get the Turks to leave. And part of it is the Turks are just they're too pragmatic. They won't go for it. Um, I don't know. The Kurds are a problem for the Turks inside Turkey, but um, I mean, it's just usually the run-of-the-mill terrorist attacks that seem to coincide with other big geopolitical events that might include America and Israel when it happens. I I don't know. I think Turkey's not being completely honest why they're in Syria.
no, no, not at all. And if there is more of a solution on the Syrian end with the so-called SDF forces, I could see that as more of a motivation for Turkey to leave. But they're everyone's at an impasse here. The Syrians are at an impasse, the Turks are at an impasse, the Kurds are at an impasse, and I what the ultimate solution to that is probably has to come from some sort of reconciliation between the Syrian government and the Kurds, with a brokered talk between Syria and Turkey with the Russians and or the Chinese in order to solve that situation. And that's the path that things seem to be going down right now. As we all know, negotiations are a very fickle thing that could fall apart very quickly. So I don't want to speak too soon on that, but ultimately the current path is really the only viable path.
Hmm. And of course, the Turkish elections are coming up.
Yes, and
The
in terms of the opposition, once again, foreign policy wise, especially on the big issues, there's not that much deviation. Now, however, we've seen this kind of thing play out before,
Yes,
where,
yeah.
and of course, once the American embassy, the American ambassador starts making his calls, whatever, we can see how fast tunes will change. But Turkey is also one of those very unique nations when it comes to its relationship with the American empire and the rest of the world, where even a post Erdogan Turkey would probably still have a lot of bargaining power. But ultimately, I am still of the opinion Turkey is it's a ticking time bomb. It will be a problem for everyone at some point in the future. It's just too strategically placed in order for it to remain stable.
Right, unless it's extremely strong. And you've got The Economist with on May 5th, their cover says the most important election of 2023 in big, bold black letters on a white background. And then they have like, the stupid stickers vote. Erdogan
uh,
must go. Save democracy.
I wonder
Save
I
democracy.
wonder how much
How do people
those
fall?
graphic
It's like you're just saying save liberalism and American hegemony. Like it's not save
I
democracy.
want to know how
Now
much
he
those
is
graphic
trailing. He
designers
is
get
trailing
paid
Erdogan.
because
Yeah.
it seems like a really fun job and it seems like a really easy job because I could slap these things together. And I detest these people, I detest their ideas, and I could slap these things together. I don't know, maybe that's the winning move here. Maybe I just need to milk the regime from their money just by being a very poor graphic designer for Time magazine or The Economist or I don't know. I love The Economist covers in particular because I think it was the one where it was Putin, Xi Jinping, Orban, Erdogan, Assad, and I think they had it was Muhammad bin Salman. It was just a bunch of them, and it was like King Me. It's like just these caricatures that make these that are actually very flattering of them, makes them look very intimidating and powerful, just all standing on the cover, and it's like, what favors are you doing here to yourself when because at the end of the day, and perhaps my mind isn't poisoned enough by liberalism to understand what they're really coming from, but at the end of the day, there's kind of it's they have a tendency of portraying these people as a lot more interesting and cooler than they actually are.
Hmm.
And I don't know, perhaps that's my own biases, but I suppose that being said, we can move on to East Asia. I will start with Taiwan because I do find Korea more interesting. I'd prefer to finish off the show with Korea because I think that is the up and coming hotspot here. So, without further ado, Taiwan has been a story that has had several, let's just say, a lot of hype around it. We can put it that way, where something is always going to happen, but nothing ever really ends up happening. And I'm not saying nothing will ever happen, but there is a lot of false initiative, I guess you could say, around the topic of Taiwan, where everyone is expecting everyone else to make the first move to really set this off, especially as Ukraine does tend to seem to be going in a certain direction. Everyone has shifted focus there to the point where you have the White House saying they're going to send something to the tune of $500 million worth of weapons to Taiwan over the course of the next whatever ridiculous Pentagon timeframe that they do give. You had Biden himself saying that. You had the document that came out of the Pentagon, wasn't even leaked, but publicly released by the Pentagon, talking about they need to be prepared for a conflict with China by 2025. And then there were also reports, once again, openly expressed by the Pentagon, which, I mean, when the Pentagon openly tells you something, there's always more to read into it, but you can generally take it at face value. Now, I'm not gonna say always take it at face value, but there's a certain amount that you can take it for face value whenever the Pentagon does just outright come out and say something. And they were saying that they are preparing for a conflict with China in the near future. So that's the push that everyone wants to make. It is coming mostly from the West. Now, China has had its grandstanding on the issue of Taiwan, but I still maintain that China is dedicated to having a negotiated peace to Taiwan, especially with the KMT elements in the country. The KMT is still a very popular political party in the country, and despite their origins, despite their stated positions, of course, they don't expect the Republic of China to become the legitimate government overnight. And that's the hardline position they have to take, but negotiations would be far more realistic in terms of integration. And it is actually interesting because the KMT, which is very pro business and very conservative by the standards of East Asia, is the pro Beijing party, relatively speaking. Now, they're not entirely pro Beijing, but relatively speaking, they are the pro Beijing party. And the more left wing party, I can't exactly remember the name of it, the one that's in power right now, the one that ramrodded through gay marriage, had the lesbian president, prime minister, whatever it was, are adamant about the what is fundamentally the secession of Taiwan from China proper. Whereas the KMT maintains that the government in mainland China is not favorable, China needs to be returned to the Republic of China, whatever. Once again, that's all rhetoric. When it comes to the more realistic elements, the KMT, they are pro-integration of some form. Now, maybe that would lead to some significant policy changes in China to accommodate Taiwan after, what, 70 some years of separation, but time could only tell with that. But it seems that the only people really adamant about pushing a war over Taiwan are the Pentagon. You don't even see this from other East Asian countries. You don't even see this from, say, in Australia or really any other country in the world, including China. The sole country focused on conflict over Taiwan is the U.S. Nobody else wants to be the one to set off that war. Nobody else wants to be the one to even mention that war because it's really in nobody else's interests. Because despite maybe poor relations with China on the part of some of the Southeast Asian states, which that is quickly changing, even Vietnam, which was drifting away from China, has changed course as the American empire has become more impotent. Even, say, the Philippines also has that very strange relationship with China. Japan, while very adversarial, has strong economic ties, and as I always say, Japan could find itself in a situation that Turkey is in terms of being a pretty powerful middleman that neither side can really shake in East Asia. But ultimately, the only people who want to see, number one, China invade Taiwan, and number two, want to confront China over an invasion of Taiwan, it all comes out of the Pentagon. It all comes out of the U.S. No other country in the world. I don't know. Maybe a few shills within some micro-American protectorates feel this way, but no significant country in the world wants to see this boil over except the U.S.
Yes. And I just think your idea that they would prefer Korea more than Taiwan, I think makes a lot of sense. Um, how much play can they get there? I don't know. Like the Americans recently sent nuclear submarines in that area. I forget whether they're giving them to the South Koreans or the Americans are just going to increase their numbers. However, I don't know like a lot of his posture because I don't know what they're going to like what are they going to achieve there, right? The prize is still Taiwan, but like if they could get a the question is are the Koreans willing to engage in that? Japan, there are papers right now to extend Japan, NATO or some kind of NATO aligned organization to Japan. That was just announced today. So they would probably set up some kind of a tripwire, agitate North Korea. That would force Japan and South Korea and the US to fight against China. Now, again, if the Americans are telling the truth about how many munitions they have, because just this past week they took more munitions from the Israelis.
And from South Korea is another country they've been pillaging for ammo.
That's right.
In which
That's
case,
right.
and like I said, while I do think the U.S. would like to see war over Taiwan, I'm convinced that their primary goal in East Asia right now is some sort of confrontation with North Korea.
Right, because the stakes, you had that one ridiculous American senator, or he might have been a congressman. He said something like, "Oh, if China's going to invade Taiwan, we're going to blow up the TSMC plant." Right? And then, like the next day, TMC said, "That's not necessary. That doesn't have to happen." Um, I mean, as time progresses, Taiwan will be less valuable to the Americans than it is in one aspect, in terms of the technological aspect.
Yes, in terms of
Simply
all the
because
industry that they had
because the
outsourced.
Chinese are
Yeah.
catching up, and even the binned microchips that they're giving to the Chinese have proven that even those chips are learning AI at a much faster rate, at over twice the rate that they were before. So, Taiwan's value is that it's like a permanent battleship facing China. I mean, I for the first time ever, I've heard discussed um openly about, what we've been saying for about 2 years, that eventually America will have to resort to piracy. I mean, they already are, but just on a larger scale. Usually they just do this to the Iranians,
Yes,
right? And
countries
then the
that
Iranians
don't really,
retaliate, but they
yeah,
haven't done it to the Chinese yet.
the countries they know that they could actually have the ability to provoke without seeing a direct response, whereas China, while they might not see a direct response, certainly has the capability, which has been once again a deterrence to seeing any sort of naval harassment of the Chinese to any great scale. And I would agree with you also when it comes to the technological industry, with a lot of industry that was outsourced to Taiwan. Quickly, mainland China is having substitutes for that. And also, you have to consider one of these other points that a lot of these Taiwan hawks do bring up that they are fundamentally right about is that there is so much Chinese influence in so many American just institutions in general, especially when it comes to the tech industry, that they could have anything they wanted, and they have most of what they need as well because they are so well ingrained within these American institutions. Which, funny enough, the same people kvetching about Taiwan right now are the same people who opened the door to all this foreign influence within these American institutions and tech industry and everything else under the sun. So I mean, that's just the neoconservatives for you. They're perpetually scorned lovers. Of course, they were infatuated with Bolshevism early on. Stalin came along, ruined that dream for them. They all became acolytes of Trotsky. Uh, Cold War goes on. They collapse the Soviet Union. Whatever. They're big in the idea of integration with China with a new global order where China is the manufacturing engine, but America still runs the world. China uses the wealth it gained from playing that role as a manufacturing engine and started to assert itself as an actual world power. And now, once again, they are behaving like spurned lovers, and China needs to be destroyed because of that.
Hmm.
And it it's the same story over and over. But on the topic of why I think Korea is the new hotspot here, number one, it's far more realistic. It's far more realistic to spark a conflict on the Korean Peninsula. And as you were saying, it's also far more realistic to draw China into something like that and lead to an expansion of conflict. Number two, it's far less costly. You wouldn't need a draft. You would need less military resources. South Korea would be able to bear the brunt of the military engagement with North Korea. The war in Ukraine has showed us what wars of the 21st century will look like. So, whereas the Korean Peninsula could have these very slow-moving battle lines that are very entrenched, kind of hard to do that on an island with like Taiwan, given the geography of the situation, would be mostly a naval war between China and the U.S., which I'm not saying is off the table, but I think given what we've seen and what both sides have probably learned from Ukraine, that Korea does seem far more likely. And also, another reason I do bring up Korea is actually its nuclear program. Now,
Hmm.
perhaps they would use them, perhaps they would attempt to use them, but I do think the U.S. posturing against Korea, even if they were to use South Korea as a major proxy for this, shows that despite Korea's nuclear program, they are still willing to be confrontational with them over it, and then try to send that cascading message to, I would say, primarily Iran, but then also by extension Russia or China, that just because you have nukes doesn't mean we aren't going to be belligerent towards you. Although that is the effective policy for now, but the longer they continue with that, the more they have to concede because they have to realize they are on somewhat of an equal playing field if they do also have their own weapons of mass destruction like we do. Once again, getting back into the principles of mutually assured destruction, I'm sure none of you need to hear this, but I'll reiterate just for the sake of the point here. But if they can successfully even just harass Korea, a nuclear armed Korea, whether that be moving their submarines in there, joint drills with South Korea, whatever else it may be. It also tells Russia, China, Iran, and any other nuclear armed powers that the U.S. is not going to take as strong as consideration to a nuclear deterrence as maybe it once did. Now, that's a very dangerous position to be in. I don't think anyone really wants us, anyone sane, I should say, really wants to be in that position. But this also goes back to another long-time theory of the show where it is a not a strong likelihood, but it is a viable possibility the U.S. does use low yield nuclear weapons in a conflict in the near future in order to maintain its projection of power. I would certainly believe that. I do think that a outbreak of war in the Korean Peninsula would give them just the excuse for that. Launch some small yield weapons that they certainly do have in the region. They do have in South Korea. They do have in Japan. Despite what they may say, they do have them there. I don't think anyone's going to deny that. And even if not, what you have Guam, you have all the other chains of islands that you have the submarines. They are within striking distance, quick striking distance of North Korea. Now, would North Korean defenses be enough to intercept those strikes? Possibly. Their air defenses are nothing to sneeze at, but still, it's a very real possibility we could get a low yield nuclear weapon in a potential future conflict with Korea. And I do think that if it does maintain the American empire for another 5 to 10 years, they will irradiate the Korean Peninsula.
Yeah. Ultimately, maybe South Korea is more expendable to the Americans, because I think when the Americans said that they were going to introduce these sanctions regarding the chip industry with China, they said they had to tailor these sanctions so there wouldn't be the kind of blowback that affected Europe with the Russian sanctions. I'm sure they thought about that even before the war started. So that hesitancy um, that America has toward, like, I agree with you. I think like what you're getting at is they would rather have like some kind of a slow bleed on China that would affect them, that because I don't want to generalize, but shame is a very big um emotion and a social signifier in China, right? So
All of East Asia, for that matter.
all of East Asia, right? You're right. And so if you can make China look weak without necessarily affecting your own economy, right? To persuade all these partners, because Vietnam has not budged, right? Now they finally broke the Philippines. The Territo's gone, and so the new guy, even he resisted the Americans for a while, and then, oh yeah, you can build three new bases, and then he had the audacity to fly to Beijing and ask for money for investment, which he's not going to get. Um, so what they want is more of that. Like, you
Yes,
have to go along
and
with us. Look at China; they're so weak, right? Um, because let's say they do go to the whole piracy thing. I think it's just it would be like it would be game over at that point. It would be just like fighting over Taiwan. Like,
yes,
I'm
and
not saying it's not going to come, but I'm saying that what they love doing, the globalists, the American globalists, what they love doing is this incremental thing where they establish a certain emotion amongst the public, and an acceptance, usually of very negative outcomes, or a switch in the direction of relations, and then they'll up the ante a bit more, a bit more. All the whole time, what they're doing is getting you used to. They're blackpilling you, and they're getting you used to it. So when the next one comes along, you accept that as well,
yes,
right?
yes.
It's like a slow defeat. It's the boiling frog thing scenario. You could say.
And I'll also add, in terms of the American approach to East Asia, which is to whittle down China, while I do think they would love to go complete mask off and confront China over Taiwan, or even spark a conflict on the Korean Peninsula, which I do think is far more likely than Taiwan, as I've previously stated for many reasons, that although they were willing to deal the kind of blows they did to Europe in order to try to bring Russia down a peg, well, number one, it didn't work. Number two, they can't completely destroy the European nations. They need to keep them at least barely
Yeah.
functional. Now, that doesn't mean that Europe's ever going to be relevant again. That doesn't mean Europe isn't just going to be complete client state of the U.S. collectively, which that's what's become as a result of the Russian-Ukrainian war. But if they were to, due to China, what they did to Russia, pull the plug completely,
Oh
Europe
yeah.
is completely finished. Europe is going to implode. And because right now Europe is, like I said, they just barely have their neck above the water, which is right what the American Empire wants, and they're going to tolerate that, and they're going to do everything in their power to either keep them raised up above the water or push them back down where their neck is just barely above the water. It's the perfect position for
Hmm.
the Europeans to be
Hmm.
in. But if you pull the plug on China, the Europeans are going to drown. There's no two ways about it. And they can't afford that, and not to mention
Excellent point.
there are other interests in East Asia that would suffer to the same degree as the Europeans maybe did as a result of the Russian-Ukrainian war. Not as much as the Ukrainians would suffer from being cut off from both Russia and China, but it's while I think they would love to, it's not a viable option just to completely pull the plug. And there is a realistic way around that by whittling down China, by trying to show them as a weaker power than they are, trying to play up the China is a paper tiger narrative that they've been pushing for how many years now? And of course, that's never really come to fruition. China's only grown in strength while the American empire has weakened in strength, not just militarily, but economically and politically as well.
Yeah.
But they need to, fundamentally, it really does go back to the tired line we've been hearing for the past 25 years that China is a paper tiger. That's really the only thing they can fall back on.
You hear so much less of this. I heard that in 2017, 18, 2019. Ooh, not so much after 2020. Not so much, but I used to hear it a lot. And Westoids reveled in it. They reveled in it. It was like having a personality or a culture. It was just something else. It's I guess we haven't spoken about it, but it's kind of like Westoids and Nafos and Yuki's um jubilant over the arrest of Gonzalo Lira. Like they react like they took back Crimea. It's just that's how starved they are.
it's
Anyways, it's
it
hilarious.
is rather pathetic. And touch on the paper tiger thing yet again. Not only is it that great kind of rhetoric for what they want, it also prevents the professional class in the Pentagon and the think tanks, whatever, from doing any real work because they can just say what's popular. China is a paper tiger rather than develop an actual strategy vis-a-vis China in order to actually address the problem that is facing the American empire. And I will say once again, love him or hate him, Donald Trump in particular, but getting down into his cabinet, Tillerson, Mike Flynn, the original foreign policy team Trump brought on, while I wouldn't call myself necessarily a supporter or in agreement with most of them, I can give credit where credit is due. The fact that they had a very realistic approach on how to keep America as a relevant power that isn't just a complete sick man of the world. And
Mhm.
look at what happened. Flynn is still going through legal issues for a simple call to the Turkish ambassador, or the Russian ambassador through Turkey, uh,
Yes.
and then Tillerson has completely disappeared off the radar because I know he wasn't there that long, but I do think that honestly, Tillerson was one of the sanest voices within the Trump administration. That he was one of the wisest people in the Trump administration. And once again, he
Hmm.
was an oil man. He was very pragmatic. And his game was business. And I do think that Tillerson probably would have been a pretty good Secretary of State, especially compared to the last few, had he been allowed to say. Certainly better than somebody like Mike Pompeo, without a doubt. Now that's not a very high bar
Hmm.
there, but I think once again, while I'm not saying Trump would have dismantled the American empire or anything, I think he would have put the American empire in a much more reasonable and survivable position, but that would have come at the cost of a lot of the influence it wields around the world. It would have been trading power for longevity, and at that point, it's funny because right now that's what they're trying to do. They are trading power for longevity, but I mean, arguably it was too late when Trump's initial foreign policy team, tried to do
Hmm.
it, but now it is certainly too late for that.
Right. And Gio and I were talking about this yesterday, and that is I still feel like I think I like your Korea scenario. I think it has real possibilities. But at the moment, I hadn't heard you say this. So yesterday night we were talking, and I said, they can't go in a direct confrontation with China, right? First of all, they've just invested too much into Ukraine. Second of all, if they are successful in Ukraine, then it would be a kind of shaming to China as well, but it would have even more of an impact than, say, North Korea. Because the fact is Russia's more invested in North Korea than China is, right? Um, so I don't know. Like, I mean, they could do something with South Korea that creates tension. Something that will give them like a boost, to spook them, like the Ukrainian counteroffensive. It'll be like it'll be so amazing. People will like they'll be swimming like off of Crimea, um, in order to survive. Anyways, like it would have to be something like that. But I just think like for them, the easiest route is Russia. They can't. Ultimately, I think even Russia is more important to them than China is, because if you control Russia, you eventually control China. So,
Absolutely. And I do also think it goes back to the point where, especially the question with control over Europe and what I guess you could ostensibly call Western civilization, just because Russia is so much more of a familiar force, they are conversely more of a threat because of that, whereas China is far more of an alien force when it comes to that. Not that they don't fear China, not that they don't fear a potential Chinese hegemony, but in terms of where the American empire is really invested, Russia is a more feared alternative to that because they present a more familiar option, so to speak. And we've talked about this before in terms of that, where it's non-Western, but it's not completely Oriental. It's not completely alien or divorced from, say, Europe in particular and other parts of the world as well. And I also do want to add on the point of what I was thinking about Korea. While these would be much more marginal interventions, I could also see, and I do think we will see, as tensions do increase in both Thailand and Myanmar, we will see American involvement in there to try to stymie Chinese influence there. Not to mention also trying to solve the Indian question with India drifting more towards Russia and even China at that point. Trying to bring India back into the Western orbit is also going to be a major priority of theirs. But once again, I maintain that the major American actions, the major American moves that we will see in the near future in East Asia will be on the Korean Peninsula.
hmm, I'm, I'm. I hate to say it, I can't wait, but it's very it is very interesting. It makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I and this actually isn't something I've been sitting on for a while. This is something I've just developed it with. As the tensions in Korea have arisen, it has been something that has come to my attention. I haven't given it much more than a few days thought on this, so as time
Hmm.
goes on, I will flesh this idea out more. But this is just me sharing what has come to me in the past few days here.
I think it's great.
Well, I guess we could round out with just some miscellaneous news on Sudan and other smaller issues, but mainly Sudan here. So, the embassy in Sudan was actually, the American embassy was actually evacuated, which is a bit of a surprise, all things considered, given the American track record on actually evacuating their diplomatic personnel from these sort of situations. But it was done, and the situation hasn't had too many major updates. It seemed to be one of those things that people talked about and then forgot about as soon as it happened. And I found myself in an awkward position doing the show, and I'm sure you can attest to this as well, where it came to the point where when it first happened, we didn't have enough information to discuss it. And now that we do have more of a clear picture, the winds have blown over it, and most people have just forgotten about the situation here. And once again, I still haven't quite made sense of what's happened here. As far as I gather, you can't really attribute it to a great powers play because the American empire isn't really putting that much investment into Sudan or into Africa in general, and just leaving it to Russia and China. The fears of Russia and China having a split over this, or perhaps the hopes on some people's part of Russia and China having a split over this, are obviously completely unfounded. They're not going to cause a second Sino-Russian split over who controls the Sudanese government. That's not going to happen, and it's really comes down to just an African power struggle that I do think found itself at a very contentious time, so it got a lot more attention than it normally would have. But I mean, it did also bring to the attention, as you were bringing up earlier in the show, that although I said the Americans are not that invested in Africa, they still do have quite a significant presence, even somewhere like Somalia. They have some naval bases on the Horn of Africa as well, and that while it's not nearly as deep as say Chinese investment in Africa, it still is a significant presence there, and it's also the potential for another U.S. intervention. Now, I think somewhere like Sudan is a lot most important than say even the aforementioned Korea situation we were talking about. So I doubt we'll really see anything further from this, but I do think it's just worth addressing because it's one of those things that we just haven't gotten around to yet because of the strange media cycle and honestly the strange cycle of events that actually did take place absent the media.
Yeah, I mean, you could look at them evacuating the embassy as a sign that no, they are, as far as I know, I think they are supposed to put American troops in Sudan. The New York Times and the Washington Post had this stupid article that they mirrored. The subject matter, the way it was presented, the narratives mirror each other, and that is, you know, we did democracy really wrong in Sudan. We should never have given it to these generals and warlords. We should, I kid you not, we should have invested more in public support. This is so like, oh my God,
it's literally
I hate the religion of democracy. I hate it so much.
it's the dem programs of foreign policy.
Yeah, so they're saying, guys, we're gonna have to go in. We messed up the democracy. We have to redo the democracy in Sudan.
I You're right. I can't stand these people. They are detestable. There's no two ways about it. There's
Yeah, it's
and
like who are you like? Okay, you have all these generals and warlords, of war that's been going on for 12 years off and on. You know, that's why this is South Sudan. Um, um, I think you understand. You know, you're not going to create a popular front using civilians. Like, I guess there's just not enough Sudanese that studied, you know, in Harvard or Brown University or wherever.
I guess not. I guess they just don't have all those doctors and lawyers because our immigration system has deprived them of their doctors and lawyers, as we all know. But
Yeah, I mean,
I do have to say, not that I would support the American empire if they were a raw, self-interested empire, simply because of how destructive of a force they've been, and even minus the religion of democracy, the religion of wokeness, whatever, it would still be a terrible, destructive force, as I do think we've seen time and time again. But I will say, it makes them, it does them really no favors beyond a small segment of the population, and that the they probably could have much more support for American imperial activity if they were to take a simply purely pragmatic approach to all of this, but they will not do that at this point. That
no,
ship has sailed, and simply because the American empire has become too reliant on once again these democracy janissaries, as I'll call them, whether they be some ethnic minorities, some rights advocacy group, whether that be LGBTQ, CIA, women, whatever else. It
yeah,
it
it's loyalty,
it is
loyalty and
loyalty.
obedience.
It is these people are outposts of Washington D.C. no matter where they are in the world, and they will take their marching orders from them, and they will be more loyal to D.C. than they will to their own homes, and that's the at this point that's the only way the American empire really knows how to conduct itself. Now, you could even say during the Cold War it had far more of a pragmatic approach where any anti-Soviet force was a friend, which look, had its ups and downs, but it was a far more pragmatic policy than needing, as once again I'll call them democracy janissaries in any country that they're going to deal with.
Yeah, so I mean, America is at the forefront of the LGBTQ revolution. Anybody who identifies adjacent or an ally to it knows that without America, this thing doesn't even exist. I do think there's something else because involved in all of this that I think is mostly like it's more subconscious, and that is okay. So, um, the first more Sudanese refugees are going to start filing their way into Europe. There's no doubt of that. I've already seen some reports that that has begun. So the worse that this conflict gets, and the longer it goes on, the more that will happen. Now here's the point, right? Like, I don't want to ignore the contributions of a certain tribe determining immigration and demographics in America and all kinds of other laws, especially in higher learning and who's accepted and not. But um, I think also it's fair to say that you know the Americans did have a chip on their shoulder for despite the revolution that they were a colony. And I mean, they spoke a different English, but they still spoke the language of the colonizer. And there is a strain of decolonization. Everybody knows it just gets replaced by American neocolonization, but that's worthy, right? That's just protecting democracy. And in this latest episode regarding Sudan, right, that's going to make Europe more diverse. I remember way back in 2015, when RT was still around, when you could still watch it. There was some protest in the Czech Republic, and I said something to the effect of, um, it's because of the migrant crisis. I said it's part of American policy, whether they admit it or not, to make Europe diverse, to make Europe more like itself, right? And at first, it's really just, um, they, I think they resented the Europeans. They felt inferior and insecure. They had to prove that they were as good or better than them. And I think, the 20th century and the latter part of the 19th century, I think gave them that feeling that they had more or less accomplished that. Um, but the messianic quality of America just gets replaced by a new gospel. And like they're determined to make Europe as diverse as they are. And there are even Anglos and other European whites that are on board with this. And plus it's easier for mirroring policy across the pond, right? When you have a very diverse population, or you've set yourself to have one.
And once again, these people are democracy janissaries, where they are a significant wedge within the population that they can leverage
Yeah.
against the powers that be there. And look, we've seen this in Germany, and of course, just from media influence out of America when it comes to a lot of the refugee things, you can import American racial dynamics onto the new groups of migrants in Europe and the traditional European populations.
Mhm.
Because since look, the period between 1919 and 1945, in terms of redrawing borders and ethnic cleansing, was a very bloody period. But as a result of that, you did get very homogenous European states. That's just an objective fact there. And at this point, the only outstanding ethnic conflicts in Europe are in either the former Soviet Union or former Warsaw Pact countries, and even most of those have been resolved. So, in order to do that, of course, it only follows that you need to import a bunch of people, that you need to mix around the populations in order to put that ethnic and racial dynamic back into these European countries. And it's really just that simple.
Yeah, and this week you have the Pope visiting Hungary and saying Hungary just has to do more to open up the gates for immigrants to come into the country. Right? He's a complete subversive, that man. And but apparently it fell more or less on deaf ears. He was not well received, which is encouraging.
Yeah, it. I am glad to see that at least, and as you said, there's really no other words about it. It's all just subversive, and there's no ifs, ands, or buts, and there's no word that can either substitute or outdo that as a descriptor on that point.
Yeah, because I think America already, like I think at the elite level, and it's the elite level that controls the culture. I think they have decided that the one way to prove that they're not a colony, notice the like decolonization is a big word in the last 4 to 5 years, in a way that I mean, it was already popular, but it really began to gain traction during COVID and the Floyd riots, and then the Native Canadian riots that happened here, with the pulling down of statues and burning of churches. And that is that America has decided that it's going to create a new ethnogenesis, made of these, diverse populations. And then it will prove once and for all that you cannot slur it with colonialism, because it's just too diverse to be a colonizer. And then, way back years ago, you remember I said like America was the first EU, and America looks at itself as an ark, like a New Jerusalem, and that has been there, from the very beginning.
Look, I
And
know it's cliche, but I do think, and I'll add an element to this that other people have said, but I don't think I've ever heard anyone put them together. Whereas the original populations, the religious sects that originally settled America, had that very messianic quality. They were going there to prepare for the
yeah,
end of the world, etc., etc. You all know the story. And
yeah,
then, okay, so that defines the early American experience. That isn't necessarily as bad as what we have now, but once again, it's a prototype. And then you merge that with, I'll just outright say it, 20th century Jewish immigration with the Jewish ideas of the world and their own eschatology. Even after you secularize both those groups, certain things just stick with them. The wedding of those two, you get the most, and I'll use this term in like its most academic sense. You get the most apocalyptic ideology that you can with the wedding of these two groups.
yeah, yeah. Plus, also their inherent mercantilism, for each of these groups, right? Um, Compared to continental Europe, they've always been in areas that are far safer because they're surrounded by water. Um, but it's just that, if you want to look, you have to look like the future of the world. And that's what I think is behind mass immigration and, trying to subtly, create a, new ethnogenesis in North America, particularly in America, but it's happening in Canada as well. That's why you have all these commercials where it's constantly mixed race couples with their mixed race kids, constantly. Right? They know it could be a powder keg, right? If the economy goes bad, you have all these diverse people, they're going to stick within their own groups. That's where they're going to feel safest, and they want to avoid that a lot. But they need to make Europe like that in order to keep Europe within their grasp.
Yes, that's exactly what it comes down to, and it is. And the last point I'll make on this before wrapping up the show, it is somewhat ironic that the country with the most pockets of uh, internal ethnic groups in Europe, that being Russia, is the one that has so far proven itself most immune to the American Empire. Now, that's not to say that the American Empire hasn't meddled in Russian ethnic politics, especially with the Chechen wars, but it it is funny because I'm not saying it's ideal, but these multi-ethnic societies can work when you take a very illiberal approach to them, when you take a very traditional approach to them, where you put certain restrictions and cede certain privileges to certain groups within certain territories that, once again, just basic empire management. And I just think it's the funniest thing in the world that they're seeding these. I mean, and Europe is more or less doomed once they get these groups in there if the situation isn't rectified quickly enough. But because they aren't able to appeal to those illiberal values, but I just do think it's funny that the country that they are most hell bent on collapsing already has what they would frankly desire from that.
Hmm.
And that's all I had for this episode. If you have anything else, certainly now's the time.
Yeah, just one last thing. The last Bayraktar drone might have been shot down in Ukraine,
Oh wow.
but it wasn't done by the Russians. It was done by the Ukrainians. So this happened Friday or
And
Saturday.
let me guess, it landed in Poland.
No, it was flying over Kiev. And this video is like this one video of a guy shooting it with his assault rifle. then, and then they actually do knock it down with presumably what would be the Patriot system. But the thing falls on a building. It goes through the building, and it's like you don't see that. But there's a video of a woman who's in a car. Someone else is driving. She's filming it, and you see this fire raging inside the building. So I don't know why they shot it. Like, I mean, I guess I don't even know why it's there. Why did it end up in Kiev? And eventually, like the Kiev regime had to admit that this was actually one of their own drones. It was not a Garon or a Shahid or whatever. And that's what they said initially, but there was just too much evidence that this was a Bayraktar. And so it could be that one of the last Bayraktars was shot down by Kiev. So, anyways, I thought, I thought that was
Well,
pretty funny.
that's quite the story to end the show on. And thank you everyone for tuning into this episode of the War Report. And we'll see you guys next time. And goodbye.
Thank you and take care.